A sterile millionaire disguises himself as a beggar to adopt a young orphan. Days later, he is shocked to hear a little boy call him Daddy. Alexander Rothschild III stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse suite, gazing out at the glittering New York City skyline. The view was breathtaking, a testament to the wealth and power of the Rothschild empire. Yet as he stood there in his tailored Armani suit, a glass of 30-year-old Scotch in hand, Alexander felt nothing but emptiness. At 28 years old, he was the heir apparent to one of the largest financial conglomerates in the world. His life had been meticulously planned from the moment he was born, every decision made with the singular goal of preparing him to take over the family business. But tonight, on the eve of his 29th birthday, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was suffocating under the weight of expectations. The soft ding of the elevator pulled him from his thoughts. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Only one person had unrestricted access to his private sanctuary. "Alexander," his father's voice boomed across the room, "I hope you're not planning on drinking yourself into oblivion tonight. Tomorrow's board meeting is crucial, and I need you sharp." Cornelius Rothschild, the patriarch of the family and CEO of Rothschild Global Investments, strode into the room with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. At 65, he was still an imposing figure, his silver hair and piercing blue eyes a stark reminder of the genes Alexander had inherited. "Good evening to you too, Father," Alexander replied, his tone carefully neutral. He turned to face Cornelius, raising his glass in a mock toast. "To what do I owe the pleasure of your company on this fine evening?" Cornelius's eyes narrowed at the hint of sarcasm in his son's voice. "Put that drink down, Alexander. We need to talk." With a sigh, Alexander set the glass on a nearby table and gestured to the leather armchairs in the living area. As they sat down, he couldn't help but feel like a schoolboy about to be reprimanded by the headmaster. "I've been watching you closely these past few months," Cornelius began, his tone measured. "Your performance at work has been adequate, but I can't help but feel that you're lacking something crucial." Alexander fought the urge to roll his eyes. "And what might that be, Father?" "I've exceeded every target you've set. The Hong Kong merger was a resounding success. What more could you possibly want?" Cornelius leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Hunger, Alexander. The drive to not just meet expectations, but to crush them. To build something greater than what came before. I don't see that fire in your eyes." The words stung more than Alexander cared to admit. He'd spent his entire life trying to live up to his father's impossible standards, and it was never enough. "Perhaps if you'd ever given me the chance to prove myself beyond your carefully controlled parameters, you'd see that fire," he retorted, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. A tense silence fell between them. Cornelius stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to Alexander. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost contemplative. "You know, when I was your age, my father thought I was too soft for this business. He decided I needed to learn the value of life outside our gilded cage." Alexander's interest was piqued despite himself. His father rarely spoke about his own past. "What did he do?" Cornelius turned back to face his son, a strange mix of emotions playing across his usually stoic features. "He arranged a marriage for me, to a woman from a working-class family in Brooklyn. It was an enlightening experience." "You've never mentioned this before," Alexander said, his mind reeling from the revelation. "What happened?" "That's a story for another time," Cornelius replied dismissively. "The point is, it taught me valuable lessons about the real world, lessons that shaped me into the man I am today." A sense of unease began to creep over Alexander. He didn't like where this conversation was heading. "Father, why are you telling me this now?" Cornelius's expression hardened, the brief moment of vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Because, Alexander, I've come to the conclusion that you need a similar wake-up call. It's time for you to step out of your comfort zone and prove that you're worthy of the Rothschild name." Alexander stood up, his heart racing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Cornelius said, his voice laden with finality, "that I've arranged a marriage for you, to a single mother from Queens. You'll meet her tomorrow, and the wedding will take place in 1 month." The room seemed to spin around Alexander. He gripped the back of the chair for support, his knuckles turning white. "You can't be serious. This is the 21st century, Father. You can't just..." "I can and I have," Cornelius cut him off. "This is not up for discussion, Alexander. You will do this, or you can kiss your inheritance goodbye. It's time you learned what it means to truly earn your place in this world." With that, Cornelius strode towards the elevator, leaving his son standing in shocked silence. As the doors closed behind him, Alexander's legs gave out and he sank into the chair. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts and emotions, anger at his father's audacity, fear of the unknown future that had just been thrust upon him, and somewhere deep down, a tiny spark of curiosity about the woman who was about to become an unwitting pawn in his father's twisted game. As the first rays of dawn began to peek over the horizon, Alexander remained motionless, staring out at the city he thought he knew. Little did he realize that his entire world was about to be turned upside down, and the journey that lay ahead would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, and the true meaning of success. The harsh buzz of an alarm clock pierced the pre-dawn quiet of a small apartment in Queens. Olivia Martinez groaned, her hand fumbling in the darkness to silence the noise before it could wake her daughter. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the worn curtains, she allowed herself a moment to lie still, gathering strength for the day ahead. At 28, Olivia's face bore the subtle lines of someone who had weathered more than their fair share of hardships. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face. Despite the exhaustion evident in her brown eyes, there was a fire there, a determination that had seen her through countless challenges. With a soft sigh, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up, wincing at the creak of the old floorboards. She padded quietly to the small kitchen, automatically starting the coffee maker, a luxury she allowed herself despite the tight budget. As the rich aroma filled the tiny space, Olivia leaned against the counter, her mind drifting to the strange phone call she had received the day before. A man claiming to be a lawyer for one of New York's wealthiest families had contacted her, requesting a meeting to discuss a life-changing opportunity. Olivia had been skeptical at first, assuming it was some kind of scam. But after some research and a few discreet inquiries, she had confirmed that the law firm was indeed legitimate. The whole situation felt surreal. What could a family like the Rothschilds possibly want with her? Olivia had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind conjuring up wild scenarios, but none of them came close to the reality she was about to face. A soft whimper from the bedroom pulled her from her thoughts. Olivia moved quickly, entering the room just as her 5-year-old daughter Sophie began to stir. "Good morning, my little sunshine," Olivia whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed and brushing Sophie's curly hair from her forehead. Sophie's eyes fluttered open, a sleepy smile spreading across her face. "Morning, Mommy. Is it school day?" Olivia nodded, her heart swelling with love for this little girl who had become her whole world. "Yes, baby. But remember, after school you're going to stay with Aunt Maria for a little while. Mommy has an important meeting." As she helped Sophie get ready for the day, Olivia's mind wandered back to the impending meeting. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this opportunity was, it would come with strings attached. Nothing in life was ever truly free, especially not for someone in her position. Once Sophie was safely on the school bus, Olivia rushed to get herself ready. She put on her best outfit, a simple black dress that she kept for job interviews and special occasions. Looking in the mirror, she took a deep breath, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't entirely feel. The trip to Manhattan was a blur of crowded subway cars and bustling streets. As Olivia approached the towering skyscraper that housed the Rothschild empire, she felt increasingly out of place. The sleek glass and steel structure seemed to mock her, a stark reminder of the vast gulf between her world and the one she was about to enter. In the opulent lobby, a receptionist with a polite but distant smile directed her to a private elevator. As the doors closed and the elevator began its smooth ascent, Olivia's stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The elevator opened directly into a plush office, where an older man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes stood waiting. His tailored suit probably cost more than Olivia made in a month, but it was the air of authority he exuded that truly intimidated her. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I'm Cornelius Rothschild. Thank you for coming on such short notice." Olivia shook his offered hand, acutely aware of the calluses on her palm, a testament to years of hard work. "Mr. Rothschild, it's a pleasure to meet you. I must admit I'm curious about why you wanted to see me." Cornelius gestured to a set of leather chairs. "Please have a seat. What I'm about to propose may come as a shock, but I assure you, it could be the solution to many of your problems." As Olivia sat down, her mind raced. What kind of proposal could this man possibly have for her? She watched as Cornelius settled into the chair across from her, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Martinez, I'll be direct. I have a son, Alexander, who is in need of, let's call it a life lesson. I believe you could be instrumental in providing that lesson." Olivia's brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rothschild, but I don't understand. How could I possibly help your son?" Cornelius leaned forward, his gaze intense. "By marrying him." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and surreal. Olivia blinked, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me?" "You heard correctly, Ms. Martinez. I'm proposing an arranged marriage between you and my son. It would be for a minimum of 1 year, during which time you and your daughter would live in a penthouse apartment we would provide. All of your expenses would be covered, and upon completion of the year you would receive a substantial financial settlement." Olivia felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. She struggled to find her voice, her mind reeling. "Mr. Rothschild, this is... I don't even know what to say. Why me? Why would you choose a complete stranger for your son?" Cornelius's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained calculating. "You come from a world very different from ours, Ms. Martinez. You've faced struggles my son can't even imagine. I believe this experience will teach him valuable lessons about life, responsibility, and the true meaning of success." As the full implications of the proposal began to sink in, Olivia felt a surge of indignation. "So, you want to use me and my daughter as some kind of object lesson for your son? We're not a social experiment, Mr. Rothschild." "I understand your reservations," Cornelius said, his tone placating. "But consider what this could mean for your daughter. The best education, opportunities she might never have otherwise. And you, Ms. Martinez, financial security, a chance to pursue your own dreams without the constant struggle to make ends meet." Olivia stood up abruptly, her hands shaking. "I need some air. It's too much to process." Cornelius nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her reaction. "Of course, take some time to think it over. But remember, opportunities like this don't come along every day. Sometimes we have to make difficult choices for the greater good." As Olivia fled the office, her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to run as far away from this insane proposal as possible. But another part, the part that had lain awake at night worrying about bills, about Sophie's future, couldn't help but consider the possibilities. In the elevator, Olivia caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. The woman staring back at her looked lost, overwhelmed by the weight of the decision before her. As the doors opened to the lobby, she took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. Whatever choice she made, Olivia knew one thing for certain: her daughter's well-being would be the deciding factor. As she stepped out into the busy New York street, the bustling crowds oblivious to the turmoil within her, Olivia Martinez prepared herself for the most difficult decision of her life. Alexander glanced at his watch, 10:45 a.m. With a resigned sigh, he straightened his tie and smoothed his hair. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be there shortly." As he made his way through the corridors of Rothschild Global Investments, Alexander felt the eyes of employees following him. News traveled fast in the corporate world, and he was sure rumors of his father's special announcement were already circulating. He kept his expression neutral, years of boardroom negotiations having taught him the importance of an impenetrable facade. The Blue Room, despite its name, was a study in shades of grey and chrome. As Alexander entered, he found his father already seated at the head of the long table, his expression as impassive as ever. Beside him sat a petite woman with long dark hair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Olivia Martinez. It had to be. Alexander's steps faltered for a moment as he took in the scene. The woman, Olivia, looked as uncomfortable as he felt, her eyes darting nervously around the room before settling on him. There was a quiet strength in her gaze that caught him off guard. "Ah, Alexander." Cornelius's voice broke the tension. Right on time, please have a seat. Alexander moved to the chair farthest from his father, directly across from Olivia. As he sat down, he couldn't help but notice the way she straightened her posture, as if preparing for battle. I believe introductions are in order, Cornelius continued, his tone maddeningly calm. Alexander, this is Olivia Martinez. Ms. Martinez, my son, Alexander Rothschild III. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Rothschild, Olivia said, her voice soft but steady. Alexander nodded curtly. Likewise, Ms. Martinez. He turned to his father, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Now that we've all been introduced, perhaps you'd like to explain the purpose of this arrangement. Cornelius's eyes narrowed slightly at his son's tone, but his voice remained even. As I explained yesterday, Alexander, it's time for you to broaden your horizons. Ms. Martinez has graciously agreed to enter into a marriage contract with you for the period of 1 year. Graciously? Alexander couldn't help but scoff. He looked at Olivia, his eyes challenging. And what exactly do you hope to gain from this arrangement, Ms. Martinez? Olivia met his gaze unflinchingly. Security for my daughter, Mr. Rothschild, and the opportunity to provide her with a better future than I could manage on my own. Her honesty caught Alexander off guard. He had expected evasion, perhaps even greed, but the simple truth of her words left him momentarily speechless. Cornelius seized the moment of silence. The terms are as follows. You will be married within the month. You'll live together in the penthouse on Park Avenue. Ms. Martinez and her daughter will have all their needs provided for, and Alexander, you will continue your work at the company while learning to navigate this new domestic situation. Alexander's mind raced, searching for a way out. And if I refuse? Then you forfeit your position in the company and your inheritance, Cornelius stated flatly. This isn't a negotiation, Alexander. It's an opportunity for growth. The room fell into a tense silence. Alexander looked from his father to Olivia, feeling trapped. He had spent his entire life preparing to take over the family business, and now it was being dangled just out of reach, with this arranged marriage as the price of admission. Olivia, for her part, sat quietly, her expression a mix of determination and uncertainty. Alexander found himself wondering what circumstances had led her to accept such an outlandish proposal. Fine, Alexander said finally, his voice tight with suppressed anger. I'll play your game, father, but don't expect me to pretend this is anything more than a business arrangement. Olivia flinched slightly at his words, and Alexander felt a twinge of guilt. It wasn't her fault they were in this situation after all, but the anger and frustration clouding his judgment left no room for empathy. Excellent, Cornelius said, standing up. I'll have the lawyers draw up the necessary paperwork. Ms. Martinez, if you'll come with me, we can discuss the details of your relocation. As Olivia stood to follow Cornelius out of the room, she paused for a moment, turning to Alexander. Mr. Rothschild, she said softly, I know this isn't ideal for either of us, but I hope we can at least try to make the best of it. Alexander watched as she left the room, her words echoing in his mind. Make the best of it? How could anyone make the best of such an absurd situation? Left alone in the blue room, Alexander slumped in his chair, the weight of his new reality settling over him like a heavy cloak. In the span of 24 hours, his life had been turned upside down. He was to be married to a stranger, to play house in some twisted social experiment of his father's design. As he stared out the window at the New York skyline, a city he had always felt he owned, Alexander Rothschild III felt for the first time in his life completely and utterly lost. The world he knew was colliding with one he had never even considered, and he had no idea how to navigate the aftermath. With a deep breath, he stood up, straightening his suit jacket. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them as he always had, with determination, cunning, and the unshakable belief in his own superiority. Little did he know that the year ahead would challenge every assumption he had ever made about himself and the world around him. As he left the Blue Room, the first seeds of change were already taking root, waiting for the storm that was to come to help them grow into something neither Alexander nor Olivia could have ever imagined. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of activity. For Olivia Martinez, it felt like being caught in a tornado, her simple life in Queens uprooted and scattered to the winds. She found herself shuttled between meetings with lawyers, stylists, and wedding planners, all orchestrated by the seemingly omnipotent Cornelius Rothschild. On a crisp autumn morning, Olivia stood in the middle of what was to be her new home, a sprawling penthouse apartment that occupied the entire top floor of a luxury building on Park Avenue. The space was larger than any home she had ever lived in, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of Central Park. It was beautiful, opulent, and completely foreign. "Ms. Martinez?" a voice called out, echoing slightly in the vast living room. "The interior designer is here to discuss your preferences for the apartment." Olivia turned to find a young woman with a tablet in hand, smiling expectantly. "My preferences?" Olivia repeated, feeling out of her depth. I'm not sure I know where to start." The designer's smile never wavered. "Not to worry, Ms. Martinez, we have a selection of design schemes pre-approved by Mr. Rothschild Sr. We just need you to choose one." As Olivia flipped through digital renderings of rooms that looked like they belonged in a magazine, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was an actor being fitted for a costume rather than a woman making a home. Each design was exquisite, but none of them felt like her. Is there perhaps something a little simpler?" Olivia asked hesitantly. "Maybe with some space for my daughter's artwork?" The designer's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Of course, Ms. Martinez. We'll see what we can do to personalize the space within the approved parameters." Meanwhile, across town in the Rothschild Global Investments building, Alexander was facing his own set of preparations. He sat in a meeting room, surrounded by a team of PR specialists and image consultants. "The narrative we're pushing is Rothschild heir gives back," a sharp-suited woman was saying, gesturing to a presentation on the screen. "We'll frame the marriage as a philanthropic endeavor, a way for you to connect with the real New York." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression a mask of boredom. "And what exactly is the real New York?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The woman faltered for a moment. "Well, you know, the working class, the everyday people who make this city run. Your soon-to-be wife represents that demographic perfectly." "How wonderfully condescending," Alexander muttered, but the team carried on as if they hadn't heard him. As the meeting dragged on, Alexander found his mind wandering to Olivia. They had barely spoken since that first meeting in the Blue Room, their interactions limited to brief, awkward encounters at various wedding-related appointments. He couldn't help but wonder how she was coping with all of this. Later that afternoon, Alexander and Olivia found themselves thrown together once again, this time for a meeting with the wedding planner in the Rothschild family's private event space. "Now for the ceremony," the planner was saying, her voice crisp and efficient. "We've reserved St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's traditional for Rothschild weddings, and the photo opportunities are unparalleled." Olivia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I'm not sure. I was raised Catholic, but I haven't been to church in years. It feels a bit disingenuous." The wedding planner's smile was strained. "Ms. Martinez, I assure you the cathedral is merely a backdrop. The religious aspects can be minimized if you prefer." "A backdrop," Alexander repeated, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Isn't that fitting? This entire wedding is just an elaborate backdrop for my father's twisted social experiment." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Olivia glanced at Alexander, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. For a moment, she saw a crack in his polished exterior, a glimpse of the frustration and resentment he had been hiding. "Mr. Rothschild," the wedding planner began, but Alexander cut her off with a wave of his hand. "No, let's be honest for once," he said, standing up and pacing the room. "This isn't a wedding. It's a business transaction dressed up in white lace and flowers. So why don't we drop the pretense and treat it like one?" Olivia watched him, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. On one hand, his words stung, a harsh reminder of the reality of their situation. On the other, she felt a strange sense of relief at having the truth spoken aloud. "Alexander," she said softly, surprising herself by using his first name. "I know this isn't ideal for either of us, but maybe we could try to find some middle ground. Something that feels genuine, even if the circumstances aren't." Alexander stopped his pacing, turning to look at Olivia with an unreadable expression. For a long moment the room was silent, the tension palpable. Finally Alexander spoke, his voice quieter than before. What did you have in mind? Olivia took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Well, instead of St. Patrick's, what if we had a small ceremony in Central Park? It's beautiful this time of year, and it feels more us. Us, Alexander repeated, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. He considered for a moment, then nodded slowly. Central Park. That could work. The wedding planner looked between them, clearly flustered by this deviation from the script. But the Rothschild traditions can be damned, Alexander finished for her, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This is our wedding, after all, isn't it, Olivia? Olivia felt a warm rush of something like gratitude. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, she felt like she had a voice, a say in what was happening to her. Yes, she said, her own smile growing. Yes, it is. As the meeting adjourned and they prepared to go their separate ways, Alexander hesitated for a moment. Olivia, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Thank you for trying to make this real. Olivia nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. As they parted ways, each heading back to their own worlds for the time being, both felt a subtle shift in the air. The wedding was still an arrangement, a contract to be fulfilled, but perhaps, just perhaps, it didn't have to be a complete farce. As Olivia hailed a taxi to take her back to Queens, to her daughter, and the life she was about to leave behind, she found herself wondering about the man she was going to marry. Alexander Rothschild III was still very much a mystery to her, a complex tangle of privilege, resentment, and carefully hidden vulnerability. Little did either of them know that their small act of rebellion in choosing Central Park for their wedding would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, each other, and the worlds they came from. The crisp October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings as a small gathering assembled in a secluded corner of Central Park. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to navigate this strange new world together. The location, a picturesque spot near the Gapstow Bridge, was a far cry from the grandiose cathedral originally planned for the Rothschild wedding. Yet as Olivia Martinez stood at the makeshift altar, her simple white dress catching the golden afternoon light, she couldn't help but feel that this was exactly right. Alexander Rothschild III stood across from her, his usual impeccable suit replaced by a more casual, though still obviously expensive, ensemble. His face was a carefully composed mask, but Olivia caught a flicker of something, nervousness, uncertainty, in his eyes as the officiant began the ceremony. The guest list had been pared down significantly from the original society affair. Olivia's side consisted of her daughter Sophie, proudly serving as flower girl, her sister Maria, and a handful of close friends from Queens. So on Alexander's side stood a noticeably small contingent of colleagues and a couple of friends who looked as though they weren't quite sure why they were there. Conspicuously absent was Cornelius Rothschild. His empty seat in the front row spoke volumes, a silent protest against his son's defiance of tradition. As they exchanged vows, simple, honest words that they had agreed upon together, Olivia found herself studying Alexander's face. There was a tension in his jaw, a tightness around his eyes that betrayed the emotional toll of the day. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembled almost imperceptibly. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant declared, his words carried away by a gust of wind that sent leaves swirling around the newlyweds. There was a moment of awkward hesitation before Alexander leaned in and placed a chaste kiss on Olivia's cheek. The small crowd applauded politely, the muted enthusiasm a reflection of the unusual circumstances surrounding the union. As they turned to face their guests, Olivia felt a small hand slip into hers. She looked down to see Sophie beaming up at her, the little girl's excitement a stark contrast to the subdued atmosphere. "Are we a family now, Mommy?" Sophie asked, her voice carrying in the quiet park. Olivia felt Alexander stiffen beside her. She squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "Yes, sweetheart. We're a family now." The reception was a low-key affair held in a nearby boathouse. As twilight fell, strings of fairy lights illuminated the rustic space, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Olivia found herself constantly scanning the room, making sure Sophie was okay. watching for any signs of discomfort or confusion from her daughter. Alexander, for his part, seemed to be going through the motions, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to social obligations. But Olivia noticed the way his eyes kept darting to the entrance, as if expecting, or perhaps hoping, that his father would make a last-minute appearance. As the evening wore on, Olivia found a quiet moment alone, stepping out onto the boathouse's small balcony overlooking the lake. The city skyline glittered in the distance, a reminder of the world she was now a part of. "Quite a view, isn't it?" Alexander's voice came from behind her. He joined her at the railing, his posture stiff, hands gripping the wood a little too tightly. Olivia nodded. "It's beautiful, and a little terrifying." Alexander glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his expression. "Terrifying?" "All of this," Olivia gestured vaguely. "Your world. It's so different from everything I know." A wry smile tugged at the corner of Alexander's mouth. "If it's any consolation, I'm finding your world equally disorienting." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the reception muffled behind them. "He didn't come," Alexander said finally, his voice low. Olivia didn't need to ask who he meant. "I'm sorry," she offered, unsure of what else to say. Alexander shrugged, aiming for nonchalance but not quite achieving it. "It's not unexpected. Cornelius Rothschild doesn't appreciate when things don't go according to his plan." "And this," Olivia said, "definitely isn't going according to his plan." "No," Alexander agreed, a hint of defiance in his tone. "No, it's not." Their moment of quiet understanding was interrupted by Sophie's excited voice. "Mommy, Mr. Alexander, it's time for cake." As they turned to head back inside, Alexander hesitated. "Olivia," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain, "I know this isn't... I want you to know that I'll try to make this work somehow." Olivia met his gaze, seeing the conflict, the reluctant commitment in his eyes. "I know," she said softly. "So will I." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of cake, dancing, and farewells. As the last guests departed, Olivia found herself standing with Alexander and Sophie at the entrance to the boathouse, facing the reality of their new life together. "Ready to go home?" Alexander asked, the word home sounding foreign in this context. Olivia hoisted a sleepy Sophie onto her hip. "As ready as we'll ever be, I suppose." The ride to the Park Avenue penthouse was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Sophie dozed against Olivia's shoulder, while Alexander stared out the window, his expression unreadable. As they entered the apartment, their home now, Olivia was struck anew by its vastness, its impersonal luxury. She turned to Alexander, suddenly unsure of what came next. "I'll show you to your rooms," he said, breaking the silence. "The designers finished setting everything up yesterday." He led them down a hallway, pointing out Sophie's room, a fairy tale wonderland that drew a sleepy gasp of delight from the little girl, and then Olivia's adjacent suite. "My room is down the hall," Alexander explained, gesturing vaguely. I assumed you'd prefer separate spaces." Olivia nodded, grateful for his consideration. "Thank you, that's probably best." As she tucked Sophie into her new bed, surrounded by more toys and frills than the child had ever seen, Olivia felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was her new reality, a life of luxury, yes, but also one of uncertainty, of navigating a world she didn't fully understand. Later, as she lay in her own palatial bedroom, sleep eluding her, Olivia thought about the man down the hall, her husband, at least in name. Alexander Rothschild III was still very much a mystery to her, a complex mix of privilege, resentment, and carefully hidden vulnerability. In the quiet of the night, in this strange new place she was supposed to call home, Olivia made a silent promise to herself. She would make the best of this situation, not just for Sophie's sake, but for her own. And maybe, just maybe, she could help Alexander find whatever it was he was looking for in this unconventional arrangement. As the city that never sleeps hummed outside her window, Olivia Martinez, now Olivia Rothschild, closed her eyes, ready to face whatever challenges the morning would bring. Little did she know that the year ahead would test her in ways she could never have imagined, challenging everything she thought she knew about love, family, and her own strength. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Park Avenue penthouse, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Olivia stirred, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous day came rushing back: the wedding, the reception, the quiet ride to this opulent apartment that was now supposed to be her home. She glanced at the ornate clock on the bedside table, 6:30 a.m. Old habits died hard, and years of early mornings to prepare for work and get Sophie ready for school had ingrained in her an internal alarm clock that seemed immune to life changes. Slipping out of bed, Olivia padded quietly to the kitchen, intent on starting a pot of coffee. To her surprise, she found Alexander already there, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, a steaming mug in his hand as he scrolled through something on his tablet. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of surprise crossing his features before he schooled his expression into polite neutrality. "Good morning," he said, his tone formal. "I hope you slept well." Olivia nodded, suddenly acutely aware that she was still in her pajamas, her hair a mess. "Good morning. Yes, thank you. The bed is very comfortable." An awkward silence fell between them. Olivia moved to the coffee maker, trying to figure out the complicated-looking machine. "Here, let me," Alexander said, setting down his mug and moving to help her. His fingers brushed against hers as he took over, and Olivia felt a jolt of something. Awareness, perhaps, of the strangeness of their situation. "Thank you," she murmured, as he handed her a steaming cup a few moments later. Alexander nodded, retreating back to his side of the kitchen island. "I usually leave for the office around 7:30, he said, his tone businesslike. "I've arranged for a car to be at your disposal if you need to run errands or take Sophie to school." Olivia blinked, taken aback by his efficiency. "Oh, thank you, but Sophie's school is just a few blocks away. I thought we might walk, actually. It's a nice day." A flicker of something, surprise, approvals, crossed Alexander's face. "Of course. Whatever you prefer." Just then, the patter of small feet announced Sophie's arrival. The little girl burst into the kitchen, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mommy! Mr. Alexander! This house is so big! Can I explore?" Alexander stiffened slightly at being addressed, looking almost panicked at the prospect of interacting with a child. Olivia stepped in smoothly. "Good morning, sweetheart. Yes, you can explore, but let's have some breakfast first, okay? And remember, inside voices." As Olivia busied herself preparing Sophie's breakfast, she couldn't help but notice Alexander watching them with a mixture of curiosity and unease. It struck her then how different their worlds truly were, her life revolving around the rhythms of parenting, his seemingly untouched by such domestic concerns. Would you like some breakfast?" Olivia asked hesitantly, holding up the box of cereal she'd found in the well-stocked pantry. Alexander shook his head. "No, thank you. I have a breakfast meeting downtown." He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. I'm not sure what time I'll be home. Don't wait up." With that, he gathered his things and headed for the door. Olivia watched him go, a strange mix of relief and disappointment settling in her chest. As the day progressed, Olivia found herself alternating between awe at the luxury surrounding her and a deep sense of displacement. She took Sophie to school, marveling at the way her daughter seemed to adapt so easily to their new circumstances. The other parents at the school gate regarded her with barely concealed curiosity, no doubt wondering about the new arrival in their exclusive world. Returning to the penthouse, Olivia stood in the middle of the vast living room, feeling lost. What was she supposed to do now? In her old life, she'd be rushing off to work, juggling a dozen responsibilities. Here, in this gilded cage, time seemed to stretch endlessly before her. She spent the day exploring the apartment, trying to add small touches to make it feel more like a home. She arranged Sophie's artwork on the refrigerator, placed a few family photos on side tables, but the space remained stubbornly impersonal, a showroom rather than a home. As evening approached, Olivia found herself growing increasingly anxious. She prepared dinner for herself and Sophie, setting a third place at the table just in case. But as the hours ticked by and Alexander failed to appear, she realized the futility of the gesture. Sophie, exhausted from the excitement of the day, fell asleep easily in her new princess bed. Olivia tucked her in, planting a soft kiss on her forehead. "Sweet dreams, my love," she whispered, grateful for this one constant in her rapidly changing world. It was nearly midnight when Olivia heard the soft ding of the elevator, announcing Alexander's return. She had been curled up on the sofa, unable to sleep, a book lying forgotten in her lap. Alexander entered quietly, loosening his tie as he walked. He stopped short when he saw Olivia, surprise evident on his face. "You're still up," he said, his voice low. Olivia nodded, setting aside her book. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "New place, I guess." Alexander moved further into the room, his movements slightly unsteady. Olivia caught the faint scent of scotch as he passed. "Long day," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "There's leftovers in the fridge," Olivia offered, "if you're hungry." Alexander paused, turning to look at her with an unreadable expression. "You cooked?" "Nothing fancy," Olivia shrugged. "Just pasta. I wasn't sure what you liked." For a moment, Alexander's carefully constructed facade seemed to crumble. He looked lost, almost vulnerable. "Thank you," he said softly. That's very kind of you." Olivia stood, suddenly feeling the need to do something, anything to break the tension. "I could heat it up for you if you'd like." Alexander shook his head. "No, I'm fine, thank you." He ran a hand through his hair, mussing its perfect style. "Olivia, I'm not very good at this." "This?" Olivia prompted gently. "This domesticity, family, I don't—" He trailed off, looking frustrated. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't easy for you either." Olivia felt a surge of empathy for this man who seemed so lost in his own home. "It's okay," she said softly. "We're both adjusting. We'll figure it out." Alexander nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Right, we'll figure it out." He glanced towards the hallway leading to their rooms. It's late." "Of course," Olivia said. "Good night, Alexander." As he disappeared down the hall, Olivia remained in the living room, her mind whirling. This man, her husband in name if not in truth, was proving to be far more complex than she had initially thought. Beneath the polished exterior and cold efficiency, there seemed to be a well of emotion he kept tightly contained. As she finally made her way to bed, Olivia found herself wondering about Alexander Rothschild III. What had shaped him into the man he was? And more importantly, was there room in his carefully ordered world for the chaos and joy that came with family life? Little did she know that the coming days would begin to answer these questions, as the carefully constructed walls around both their hearts began to show their first hairline cracks. As the crisp autumn days began to blend into one another, life in the Park Avenue penthouse settled into an uneasy rhythm. Olivia found herself adapting to the routines of her new world. Morning walks to Sophie's school, quiet afternoons in the vast apartment, and solitary evenings waiting for the soft ding of the elevator that signaled Alexander's return. It was on a particularly blustery Thursday evening, nearly 3 weeks into their arrangement, that the first real crack appeared in the carefully constructed facade of their lives. Olivia was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared dinner. Sophie sat at the island, her little legs swinging as she concentrated on her homework. The domestic scene was interrupted by the sudden, harsh ring of Olivia's phone. "Hello?" she answered, her brow furrowing as she listened to the voice on the other end. "Yes, this is Mrs. Rothschild." "I see. Yes, of course. I'll be right there." Sophie looked up, concern evident in her young face. "Mummy? Is everything okay?" Olivia forced a smile, trying to keep the worry from her voice. "Everything's fine, sweetheart, but I need to go pick up Mr. Alexander. He's not feeling well." As she grabbed her coat and purse, Olivia's mind raced. The call had been from Alexander's assistant, informing her that he had collapsed during a meeting and was now in the building's medical office. The assistant had been discreet, but Olivia had caught the underlying message. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The trip downtown was a blur of anxious thoughts. When Olivia arrived at the imposing Rothschild Global Investments building, she was immediately ushered to a private elevator. The medical office was a stark clinical space that seemed at odds with the opulence of the rest of the building. Alexander was sitting on the edge of an examination table, his usually impeccable appearance in disarray. His tie was loosened, his shirt partially unbuttoned, and his face was pale and drawn. He looked up as Olivia entered, surprise and something like embarrassment flashing across his features. "Olivia," he said, his voice hoarse. "You didn't have to come." She approached him cautiously, as one might a wounded animal. "Of course I came. You're my husband." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of their unusual situation. Alexander looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The doctor, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Rothschild, I'm Dr. Kensington. Your husband is suffering from extreme exhaustion and dehydration. I've recommended bed rest for at least 48 hours, but I have a crucial merger negotiation tomorrow," Alexander interrupted, attempting to stand. He swayed slightly, and Olivia instinctively reached out to steady him. "Alexander," she said firmly, surprising herself with the authority in her voice, "you're coming home. The merger can wait." For a moment it looked like he might argue, but then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Fine," he muttered. The ride home was silent, Alexander staring out the window while Olivia sneaked concerned glances at him. When they arrived at the penthouse, Sophie was waiting, her eyes wide with worry. "Mr. Alexander," she said hesitantly, "are you sick?" Alexander looked at the little girl, seemingly at a loss for words. Olivia stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Alexander is just very tired, sweetheart. He needs to rest. Why don't you go finish your homework in your room?" As Sophie scampered off, Olivia turned to Alexander. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's get you to bed." To her surprise, he didn't resist as she led him to his room. It was the first time she had been in his personal space, and she was struck by how impersonal it was. No photos, no personal touches, just expensive furniture and abstract art. Alexander sat heavily on the edge of the bed, looking lost. Olivia busied herself drawing the curtains and turning down the covers. "Do you need anything?" she asked. "Water? Something to eat?" He shook his head. "No, thank you, I'm fine." Olivia hesitated, then sat down next to him on the bed. "Alexander," she said softly. "What happened?" For a long moment, he was silent. Then, in a voice so low she had to strain to hear, he said, "I failed." "What do you mean?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Olivia was beginning to recognize as a sign of distress. "The merger. It's not going well. My father, he's been breathing down my neck demanding results. I've been working around the clock trying to make it happen, but—" He trailed off, and Olivia felt a surge of sympathy. For the first time, she saw beyond the polished exterior to the man beneath, a man buckling under the weight of impossible expectations. "Alexander," she said gently, "you're pushing yourself too hard. You need to rest." He laughed bitterly. "Rest? In my world, Olivia, rest is a luxury I can't afford. My father—" "Your father," Olivia interrupted, a hint of steel in her voice, "is not here. I am, and I'm telling you as your wife that you need to take care of yourself." Alexander looked at her then, really looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice raw with vulnerability. Olivia paused, considering her words carefully. "Because," she said finally, "like it or not, we're in this together. And I don't like seeing anyone run themselves into the ground, especially not someone I'm starting to consider a friend." The word friend seemed to hang in the air between them, a tentative olive branch extended across the chasm of their differences. After a long moment, Alexander nodded. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay." As Olivia helped him get settled in bed, she couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them. The carefully maintained distance, the polite facade they had both clung to, had cracked, revealing glimpses of the real people beneath. Later that night, as Olivia lay in her own bed, her mind replayed the events of the evening. She thought about the vulnerable man she had seen, so different from the confident, almost arrogant figure Alexander usually presented to the world. She thought about the pressure he was under, the expectations he carried on his shoulders. And for the first time since this arranged marriage began, Olivia found herself wondering not about how she would survive this year, but about how she could help Alexander navigate the challenges he faced. It was a subtle shift, but a profound one, from reluctant participant to active partner. As she drifted off to sleep, Olivia made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to break through the walls Alexander had built around himself. Not just for the sake of their arrangement, but because she was beginning to see the good man hidden beneath the polished exterior. Little did she know that this moment of connection, this first real crack in their carefully constructed facades, would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, each other, and the true meaning of partnership. The pale morning light filtered through the curtains of Alexander's bedroom, casting a soft glow over his sleeping form. Olivia stood in the doorway, a tray of breakfast balanced carefully in her hands, hesitating. This was new territory for both of them, crossing the unspoken boundary between their separate lives within the penthouse. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the room. "Alexander," she called softly. "I've brought you some breakfast." Alexander stirred, blinking groggily as he took in the sight of Olivia standing by his bed. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by recognition and then, surprisingly, a hint of warmth. "Olivia," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "You didn't have to do that." She set the tray down on the bedside table, shrugging slightly. "I wanted to. How are you feeling?" Alexander pushed himself up to a sitting position, wincing slightly. "Better, I think. Just tired." Olivia perched on the edge of the bed, her concern evident. "The doctor said you need to rest for at least 48 hours. I've already called your office and informed them you won't be in today or tomorrow." For a moment, panic flashed in Alexander's eyes. "But the merger can wait," Olivia interrupted firmly. "Your health is more important." Alexander stared at her, a mix of emotions playing across his face: surprise, gratitude, and something else Olivia couldn't quite identify. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you," he said softly. As Alexander ate, Olivia found herself studying him. Without his usual armor of tailored suits and carefully controlled expressions, he seemed younger, more vulnerable. It struck her how little she really knew about this man she had married. "Tell me about the merger," she said suddenly. Alexander looked up, surprise evident in his eyes. "You want to know about my work?" Olivia nodded. "We're partners in this, aren't we? Even if it's not a conventional marriage, I'd like to understand what you do, what's important to you." For a moment, Alexander hesitated. Then, slowly at first, but with growing animation, he began to explain the intricacies of the merger he was working on. Olivia listened intently, asking questions and offering insights that surprised them both. As the morning wore on, their conversation flowed more easily. Alexander found himself sharing stories from his childhood. The pressure of growing up as the Rothschild heir, the constant drive for perfection, the distant relationship with his father. In turn, Olivia opened up about her own struggles, raising Sophie as a single mother, the challenges of making ends meet, the dreams she had put on hold. "I always wanted to start my own business," she admitted. "A small bakery, nothing fancy, just a place where people could come for a good cup of coffee and a slice of homemade pie." Alexander's eyes lit up with interest. "Why didn't you?" Olivia shrugged. "Life got in the way. Having Sophie struggling to pay the bills, dreams had to take a back seat to reality." As they talked, something shifted between them. The walls they had built, the careful distance they had maintained, began to crumble. For the first time, they saw each other not as reluctant partners in an arranged marriage, but as individuals with hopes, fears, and dreams. The day passed quickly, punctuated by Sophie's excited chatter when she returned from school and quiet moments of companionable silence. As evening fell, Olivia found herself reluctant to leave Alexander's side. "I should let you rest," she said finally, standing up. Alexander reached out, catching her hand. The touch sent a jolt of awareness through them both. "Olivia," he said softly, "thank you for today, for everything." She squeezed his hand gently. That's what partners are for. As Olivia left the room, closing the door softly behind her, Alexander leaned back against his pillows. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, he felt seen. Not as the Rothschild heir, not as a business asset, but as a person. Meanwhile, Olivia stood in the hallway, her hand still tingling from Alexander's touch. She had glimpsed a side of him today that she never expected. A man with doubts and insecurities, yes, but also with a quick wit and a surprising depth of understanding. Over the next few days, as Alexander recuperated, A new rhythm emerged in the penthouse. Olivia would bring him breakfast each morning and they would talk about business, about their pasts, about their hopes for the future. In the evenings, they would have dinner together with Sophie, the little girl's chatter filling the once silent apartment with laughter. On the third day, as Alexander prepared to return to work, he found Olivia in the kitchen, poring over a stack of papers. "What's all this?" he asked, curiosity piqued. Olivia looked up, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Oh, it's nothing. Just some old business plans I drew up years ago, for the bakery." Alexander sat down beside her, genuinely interested. "May I see?" As they pored over the plans together, Alexander found himself impressed by Olivia's thoroughness and creativity. "These are good," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Really good. Why didn't you ever pursue this?" Olivia shrugged. "Like I said, life got in the way, and well, I'm not sure where I fit in this new world." Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering. Then, with a decisiveness that surprised them both, he said, "Let's do it." Olivia blinked. "Do what?" "Open the bakery. We have the resources. You have the passion and the skills. Why not make your dream a reality?" For a moment, Olivia was speechless. Then slowly a smile spread across her face. "You're serious?" Alexander nodded, feeling a surge of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. "Absolutely. We're partners, right? Let's build something together." As they began to discuss possibilities, their heads bent close over the papers. Neither of them noticed Sophie watching from the doorway, a knowing smile on her young face. That night, as Olivia lay in bed, her mind racing with plans and possibilities, she realized something fundamental had changed. This arrangement, this marriage of convenience, had become something more. It had become a partnership, a meeting of minds, and perhaps of hearts. Across the hall, Alexander too lay awake, his thoughts a whirlwind. For the first time in his life, he felt excited about something beyond the next business deal. He felt alive. As both of them drifted off to sleep, neither realized that their worlds had shifted irrevocably. The walls between them had begun to crumble, and in their place something new and unexpected was beginning to grow. Little did they know that this newfound connection would soon be tested in ways they could never have anticipated, as the outside world and their own pasts threatened to intrude on the fragile new reality they were building together. The aroma of freshly baked bread and cinnamon filled the air of the small commercial kitchen Olivia had rented for the day. She stood at a stainless steel counter, flour dusting her cheeks, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Beside her, much to her surprise, stood Alexander, his usually impeccable suit replaced by jeans and a casual button-down, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. "Okay," Olivia said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Let's see if the great Alexander Rothschild can handle a rolling pin." Alexander raised an eyebrow, accepting the challenge. "I'll have you know I excel at everything I attempt." As he began to roll out the dough for apple turnovers, his movements clumsy but determined, Olivia couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in the past few weeks. The project of opening her bakery had breathed new life into their arrangement, transforming it from a cold business deal into something warm and unexpectedly fulfilling. You know," Alexander said, pausing to wipe flour from his brow, "I can't remember the last time I did something this hands-on. It's oddly satisfying." Olivia smiled, reaching over to adjust his grip on the rolling pin. "It's about creation, not just acquisition. There's joy in making something from scratch, in seeing the fruits of your labor." As their hands touched, a spark of awareness passed between them. For a moment they stood frozen, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Then the timer dinged, breaking the spell. Olivia cleared her throat, stepping back. "That'll be the sourdough. I should check on it." As she busied herself with the oven, Alexander watched her, a mix of confusion and warmth in his eyes. This woman, thrust into his life by his father's machinations, had somehow become important to him. Her strength, her creativity, her unwavering focus on providing for Sophie, it all challenged his preconceived notions of what mattered in life. The day passed in a whirlwind of baking, tasting, and planning. By the time they packed up the samples to take home, both were exhausted but exhilarated. "I think we have our menu," Olivia said, her eyes shining with excitement. Now we just need to find the perfect location. Alexander nodded, already mentally reviewing potential properties. Leave that to me. I have some connections in real estate that might be useful. As they drove home, a comfortable silence settled between them. It was broken only when Alexander's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. I should take this, he said, his voice tight. It's my father. Olivia nodded, trying to ignore the sudden tension that filled the car. She couldn't hear Cornelius's side of the conversation, but Alexander's responses were short and clipped. Yes, father. No, I haven't forgotten. The board meeting is next week. Yes, I'll have the projections ready. When he hung up, Alexander's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Olivia reached over, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Everything okay? Alexander sighed, some of the tension leaving his body at her touch. Just the usual pressure. The board meeting is coming up, and my father, he has high expectations. Have you told him about the bakery project? Olivia asked hesitantly. Alexander shook his head. No, he wouldn't understand. To him, this would be a distraction from what really matters, the family business. As they pulled into the garage of their building, Olivia felt a pang of guilt. Alexander, if this is causing problems with your work, we don't have to— No, he interrupted, his voice firm. This is important. To you and to me. He turned to face her, his expression serious. Olivia, working on this project with you, it's made me see things differently. For the first time in my life, I'm doing something because I want to, not because it's expected of me. Olivia felt a warm glow in her chest at his words. I'm glad, she said softly. You deserve to have something that's just for you. As they rode the elevator up to the penthouse, both lost in thought, neither noticed the way they stood closer together than usual, their hands almost but not quite touching. The next week passed in a blur of activity. While Olivia fine-tuned her recipes and worked on a business plan, Alexander divided his time between his corporate responsibilities and searching for the perfect location for the bakery. They fell into a rhythm, working side by side in the evenings, brainstorming ideas over late-night cups of coffee. It was during one of these late-night sessions, with Sophie long asleep and the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, that Alexander broached a subject he'd been avoiding. Olivia, he said, his voice hesitant, there's something I need to ask you. She looked up from her laptop, sensing the seriousness in his tone. What is it? Alexander took a deep breath. The board meeting is the day after tomorrow. It's important. My father will be there along with all the key stakeholders. I was wondering if you'd come with me. Olivia blinked in surprise. Me? But I don't know anything about your business world. That's not true, Alexander said, leaning forward. You've been helping me with the merger plans, offering a fresh perspective. And more than that, you ground me, Olivia. When you're around, I feel more confident, more myself. The vulnerability in his voice touched something deep within Olivia. Of course I'll come, she said softly. We're partners, remember? The smile that lit up Alexander's face was breathtaking in its genuineness. For a moment, Olivia felt her heart skip a beat. But as the day of the board meeting approached, a sense of unease settled over both of them. They were stepping into new territory, blurring the lines between their arranged marriage and something deeper, more real. On the morning of the meeting, as Olivia stood in front of her closet, agonizing over what to wear, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something momentous. This meeting wasn't just about Alexander's business dealings. It was about presenting themselves as a united front, as a true couple. As she finally settled on a sleek black dress, Olivia caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked different somehow, more confident, more alive. She realized with a start that she was happy, truly happy, for the first time in years. But with that happiness came a flutter of anxiety. The more real this became, the more they had to lose. As she stepped out of her room to meet Alexander, Olivia silently steeled herself for whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did she know that the board meeting would set in motion a series of events that would test their newfound bond in ways they could never have anticipated, forcing them to confront not just the expectations of others, but their own deepening feelings for each other. The sleek elevator ascended smoothly, its mirrored walls reflecting the image of Alexander and Olivia standing side by side. Alexander, impeccable in his tailored suit, exuded an air of confidence that Olivia knew was at least partially a facade. She could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the slight clench of his jaw. Olivia reached out, gently squeezing his hand. "You've got this," she said softly. Alexander looked down at their joined hands, then up at Olivia's face. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "We've got this," he corrected her. As the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor of Rothschild Global Investments, Olivia took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. The corridor before them was all polished marble and expensive artwork, a world away from the cozy kitchen where they'd spent the past week planning their bakery. Alexander led the way to the boardroom, his hand resting lightly on the small of Olivia's back. The gesture, both protective and possessive, sent a small thrill through her. As they entered the room, all eyes turned to them. Olivia felt the weight of the stares, the silent assessments being made. At the head of the long table sat Cornelius Rothschild, his piercing gaze fixed on the couple. "Alexander," Cornelius said, his voice cool. "So glad you could join us, and Mrs. Rothschild, what an unexpected pleasure." Alexander's hand tightened slightly on Olivia's back. "Father," he replied, his tone matching Cornelius's in its formality. "Olivia has been instrumental in helping me prepare for today's presentation. I thought it only fitting that she be here." A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Olivia could feel the curiosity, the skepticism, even the disdain from some of the board members. But she held her head high, drawing strength from Alexander's steady presence beside her. As they took their seats, Alexander at his father's right hand and Olivia beside him, Cornelius called the meeting to order. "Now then," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I believe we're all eager to hear about the progress of the merger. Alexander." Alexander stood, buttoning his jacket as he moved to the front of the room. As he began his presentation, Olivia watched with a mixture of pride and awe. This was a side of Alexander she had glimpsed only in fragments, the confident businessman, the strategic thinker, the natural leader. But as the presentation progressed, Olivia noticed something else. When Alexander spoke about projected growth and market expansion, his words were confident but rehearsed. But when he touched on ideas they had discussed together, community impact, employee satisfaction, long-term sustainability, his eyes lit up with genuine passion. The board members listened attentively, some nodding in approval, others frowning in concentration. But it was Cornelius's reaction that Olivia watched most closely. The patriarch's expression remained impassive, but there was a calculating gleam in his eye that made her uneasy. As Alexander concluded his presentation, there was a moment of silence before the questions began. Most were standard business queries, which Alexander fielded with ease. But then a silver-haired woman near the end of the table spoke up. "Mr. Rothschild," she said, her voice sharp, "while your presentation was comprehensive, I can't help but notice a shift in focus. Some of these initiatives seem rather soft, not what we've come to expect from Rothschild Global." Alexander straightened, his chin lifting slightly. "If by soft you mean focused on long-term stability and ethical growth, then yes, there has been a shift. I believe it's time for Rothschild Global to lead by example, to show that profit and social responsibility are not mutually exclusive." The woman's eyes narrowed. "And where, may I ask, did these new ideas come from?" Before Alexander could respond, Cornelius cut in smoothly. "I believe we have my daughter-in-law to thank for that." All eyes turned to Olivia. "Isn't that right, my dear? You've clearly had quite an influence on my son." Olivia felt her heart rate quicken, recognizing the trap being laid. But years of facing down challenges had taught her to stand her ground. She met Cornelius's gaze steadily. "If I've had any influence," she said, her voice clear and strong, "it's only been to encourage Alexander to express his own ideas. The vision he's presented today is entirely his own, and I believe it's one that will propel Rothschild Global into a new era of success." A tense silence fell over the room. Olivia could feel Alexander's eyes on her, filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, more intense. Cornelius leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said finally, "it seems my son's marriage has been more transformative than I anticipated." He turned to the board members. "Let's take a short recess to discuss what we've heard. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. As the board members filed out, Alexander moved quickly to Olivia's side. "Thank you," he said softly, his hand finding hers under the table. "For believing in me." "For standing up to them." Olivia squeezed his hand. "Always," she replied, the word carrying more weight than either of them had expected. But their moment was interrupted by Cornelius's approach. "A word, Alexander," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "In private." As Alexander followed his father out of the room, he cast one last look at Olivia. The mixture of determination and apprehension in his eyes made her heart clench. Left alone in the boardroom, Olivia took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She had come here today as Alexander's support, his partner, but standing up to Cornelius, defending Alexander's vision, it felt like a turning point. Not just for their business relationship, but for something deeper, something neither of them had dared to name. As she waited for Alexander's return, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The careful balance they had struck, the comfortable routine they had fallen into, it all felt suddenly fragile. When Alexander finally re-entered the room, his face was pale but determined. He moved to Olivia's side, taking her hand in his. "Whatever happens next," he said softly, "I want you to know that I'm grateful. For everything. For you." Before Olivia could respond, the board members began to file back in. As Cornelius took his seat at the head of the table, his expression inscrutable, Olivia steeled herself for whatever was to come. The next few minutes would determine not just the future of Rothschild Global Investments, but the future of her relationship with Alexander. As Cornelius called the meeting back to order, Olivia held tightly to Alexander's hand, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together. The tension in the elevator was palpable as Alexander and Olivia descended from the executive floor. The board meeting had concluded less than an hour ago, but its repercussions were already rippling through their lives like aftershocks from an earthquake. Alexander stood rigidly, his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead at the elevator doors. Olivia watched him from the corner of her eye, concern etched on her features. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but the walls Alexander had carefully constructed around himself in the aftermath of the meeting seemed impenetrable. As the elevator doors opened to the lobby, Alexander strode out quickly, Olivia hurrying to keep up. It wasn't until they were safely ensconced in the back of their waiting car that he finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and strained, "for putting you in that position, for my father's behavior." Olivia shook her head, reaching out to take his hand. "You have nothing to apologize for, Alexander. I chose to be there. I'm proud of how you handled yourself." Alexander's laugh was bitter. "Proud? I just jeopardized years of work, Olivia. The board's decision to postpone the merger pending further review is tantamount to a vote of no confidence." "But they didn't outright reject it," Olivia pointed out. "Your ideas have merit, Alexander. They just need time to see that." Alexander turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. "How can you have such faith in me?" The vulnerability in his voice made Olivia's heart ache. "Because I've seen the real you," she said softly. "Not the facade you show the world, but the man who gets excited about pie recipes and stays up late brainstorming business ideas. That man has vision and heart." For a moment, Alexander's carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing a mix of gratitude and something deeper, more intense. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, turning to look out the window. The rest of the ride home passed in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, charged with unspoken emotions and possibilities. As they entered the penthouse, they were greeted by the sound of Sophie's laughter. The little girl came running, launching herself into Olivia's arms. "Mommy, Mr. Alexander, you're home!" Her excitement was infectious, and Olivia felt some of the tension from the day begin to dissipate. Alexander managed a small smile, ruffling Sophie's hair. "Hey there, kiddo. Have you been good for Mrs. Thompson?" As Sophie launched into an animated recounting of her day, Olivia watched Alexander's face soften. It never ceased to amaze her how her daughter had wormed her way into his affections, breaking down barriers that had seemed insurmountable. Later that evening, after Sophie had been put to bed, Olivia found Alexander in his study, a glass of scotch in hand, staring out at the city skyline. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently, moving to stand beside him. Alexander sighed, taking a long sip of his drink. "My father made his position clear. He thinks I've lost focus, that I'm letting personal matters cloud my judgment." Olivia felt a pang of guilt. "He means me, doesn't he? Us?" Alexander turned to face her, his expression fierce. "This isn't your fault, Olivia. My father, he's always seen the world in black and white, profit or loss. He can't understand that there might be a different way to do business." "And you?" Olivia asked softly. "What do you believe?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I believe," he said finally, "that for the first time in my life, I'm thinking beyond the next quarter's profits. I'm thinking about legacy, about the kind of world we're creating." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "And I have you to thank for that." The intensity of his gaze made Olivia's breath catch. "Me?" Alexander set down his glass, moving closer to her. "You've shown me a different way of looking at the world, Olivia. Your strength, your compassion, your unwavering focus on what really matters. It's changed me." Olivia felt her heart racing, acutely aware of Alexander's proximity. "Alexander, But before she could finish her thought, the shrill ring of Alexander's phone cut through the moment. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "It's my father," he said, his voice tight. Olivia nodded, stepping back. "You should take it. I'll give you some privacy." As she left the study, closing the door softly behind her, Olivia leaned against the wall, her mind whirling. The emotions she'd been trying to keep in check were threatening to overflow. This arrangement, this marriage of convenience, had become something so much more complex, so much more real. Inside the study, Alexander's voice rose and fell, the words indistinct but the tone clear. Frustration, anger, defiance. Olivia's heart ached for him, caught between the weight of his family's expectations and his own emerging sense of purpose. When the door finally opened, Alexander looked drained, his shoulders slumped in a way Olivia had never seen before. "Alexander?" she said softly, moving towards him. He looked up, his eyes finding hers. In that moment, something shifted between them. Alexander reached out, pulling Olivia into a tight embrace. She could feel his heart racing, his breath uneven against her hair. "I can't do this alone," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. Olivia wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "You don't have to," she murmured. "I'm here. We're in this together." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the lines between their arranged marriage and something deeper, more genuine, blurred even further. The challenges they faced, from Cornelius, from the board, from their own pasts, loomed large. But in that moment, they found strength in each other, a partnership forged in adversity and growing into something neither of them had expected. Little did they know that the true test of their bond was yet to come. As they held each other in the quiet of the penthouse, forces were already in motion that would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew, forcing them to confront not just the expectations of others, but their own deepest fears and desires. The journey that had begun as a business arrangement was evolving into something far more powerful and far more dangerous to the carefully ordered world of the Rothschild empire. The early morning sun streamed through the windows of the small storefront, casting a golden glow over the newly installed countertops and gleaming espresso machine. Olivia stood in the center of what would soon be her bakery, inhaling deeply. The scent of fresh paint mingled with the earthy aroma of coffee beans, creating a heady mix of anticipation and possibility. "What do you think?" Alexander's voice came from behind her, a hint of nervousness underlying his usual confidence. Olivia turned, a radiant smile lighting up her face. "It's perfect," she breathed. "I can't believe this is really happening." Alexander moved to stand beside her, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that had become increasingly familiar over the past weeks. "Believe it," he said softly. "You've earned this, Olivia." As they stood there, surveying the space that would soon be filled with the warmth of freshly baked bread and the chatter of customers, Olivia felt a surge of emotion. This dream, long buried under the weight of single motherhood and financial struggles, was finally coming to life. And it was all thanks to the man standing beside her, a man who had entered her life as a stranger, a business arrangement, and had somehow become so much more. "We should celebrate," Alexander said suddenly, turning to face her. "Tonight? Dinner at that little Italian place you like?" Olivia's smile widened. "That sounds wonderful. But what about Sophie?" "Already taken care of," Alexander replied with a grin. "Mrs. Thompson agreed to watch her for the evening. I thought it might be nice for us to have some time, just the two of us." The implications of his words hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Olivia felt her heart rate quicken. "Yes," she said softly. "I'd like that." Their moment was interrupted by the chime of Alexander's phone. His expression darkened as he glanced at the screen. "It's my father," he said, his voice tight. "I should take this." Olivia nodded, watching as Alexander stepped outside to take the call. Through the large front windows, she could see the tension in his posture, the clench of his jaw as he spoke. The past weeks had been a constant battle between Alexander and Cornelius, with the elder Rothschild pushing back hard against his son's new vision for the company. When Alexander returned, the lines of stress around his eyes were more pronounced. "I'm sorry," he said, running a hand through his hair. "That was intense." Olivia reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Do you want to talk about it?" Alexander sighed, intertwining his fingers with hers. "My father is pressuring me to abandon the new initiatives we proposed. He says they're diluting the Rothschild brand. He wants me to focus solely on maximizing short-term profits. Shareholders be damned." "And what do you want?" Olivia asked gently. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing absent patterns on the back of her hand. "I want to build something meaningful," he said finally. "Something that makes a difference, not just in the boardroom, but in people's lives, like this." He gestured around the bakery. "This isn't just a business, Olivia. It's a dream, a part of the community. That's what I want for Rothschild Global on a larger scale." Olivia felt a swell of pride and affection. This was the Alexander she had come to know over the past months, passionate, visionary, with a depth of caring that he had long kept hidden beneath a polished exterior. "Then that's what you should fight for," she said firmly. "You have good instincts, Alexander. Trust them." He looked at her then, his eyes intense. "I trust you," he said softly. "More than I've ever trusted anyone." The weight of his words, the vulnerability in his voice made Olivia's breath catch. They stood there, hands clasped, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. The spell was broken by the arrival of the contractor, ready to discuss the final touches on the bakery's renovation. As they threw themselves into the details of light fixtures and seating arrangements, both Olivia and Alexander felt the shift in their relationship, a deepening of their connection, a growing reliance on each other that went far beyond their initial arrangement. The day passed in a whirlwind of decisions and preparations. By the time evening fell, Olivia felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. As she prepared for their dinner, slipping into a sleek black dress that she hoped Alexander would appreciate, she found herself filled with a nervous energy she hadn't experienced in years. When she emerged from her room, she found Alexander waiting in the living room. He stood as she entered, his eyes widening as he took in her appearance. "Olivia," he breathed, "you look stunning." She felt a blush rise to her cheeks at the open admiration in his gaze. "Thank you," she said softly. "You clean up pretty well yourself." As they made their way to the restaurant, Olivia was acutely aware of Alexander's presence beside her, the warmth of his hand on her back as he guided her through the door, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his eyes seemed to constantly find hers. The restaurant was intimate and cozy, with soft lighting and the gentle strains of jazz playing in the background. As they settled into their seats, Olivia felt a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. This felt different from their usual dinners at home, more intentional, more like a real date. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on the bakery plans, Sophie's latest adventures at school, and their hopes for the future. As the evening progressed, Olivia found herself marveling at how far they had come. The guarded, somewhat cold man she had first met had been replaced by someone warm, engaged, and surprisingly vulnerable. As they lingered over dessert, a rich tiramisu that they shared between them, Alexander reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Olivia," he said, his voice low and intense, "I need you to know something. These past months, working with you, getting to know you, it's changed me, you've changed me, and I—" But before he could finish, his phone buzzed insistently. Alexander glanced at it, his expression darkening. "It's my father," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "I'm sorry. I have to take this." As Alexander stepped away to take the call, Olivia felt a mix of disappointment and concern. Whatever Alexander had been about to say, she sensed it was important. And the constant intrusion of Cornelius into their lives was becoming increasingly problematic. When Alexander returned to the table, his jaw was set in a hard line. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice tight. "My father, he's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. He's pushing for a vote on my leadership." Olivia felt a chill run through her. "What does that mean?" Alexander's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "It means that tomorrow I either convince the board to back my vision for the company, or I could lose everything. My position, my inheritance, everything." The weight of his words hung heavy between them. Olivia reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Not everything," she said softly. "You won't lose me, or Sophie, or the life we're building together." Alexander's grip on her hand tightened, his eyes searching her face. In that moment, the pretense of their arranged marriage fell away completely. What remained was something real, something powerful, a partnership forged in adversity and deepening into something neither of them had expected. As they left the restaurant, both lost in thought about the challenges that lay ahead. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from across the street, a man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, his expression a mixture of calculation and displeasure. Cornelius Rothschild watched his son and daughter-in-law disappear into the night, his mind already formulating plans. The game was changing, evolving beyond his original intentions, and Cornelius was not a man accustomed to losing control. As Alexander and Olivia returned home, both acutely aware of the battle that loomed on the horizon, they were unaware of the larger forces at play. The coming days would test not just Alexander's vision for the company, but the very foundation of the unexpected bond that had grown between them. The heat was rising, in more ways than one, and the true crucible was yet to come. The morning dawned grey and overcast, as if the very sky was reflecting the tension that hung over the Rothschild household. Alexander stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, his reflection a ghostly image against the backdrop of the New York skyline. He was already dressed in his sharpest suit, a armor of sorts for the battle that lay ahead. Olivia watched him from the doorway, her heart aching at the rigid set of his shoulders, the tension visible in every line of his body. She moved towards him, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet. "Alexander," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. He turned to her, his eyes haunted with a mixture of determination and fear. "Olivia," he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this." In that moment, Olivia saw not the polished businessman or the Rothschild heir, but the man she had come to know over these past months, vulnerable, human, and in need of support. She stepped closer, her hands coming up to straighten his tie in a gesture that felt intimately domestic. "You can," she said firmly, her eyes locked on his. "You are stronger than you know, Alexander, and you're not alone in this." He caught her hands in his, holding them against his chest. Olivia could feel the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "To the meeting. I need you there." Olivia nodded without hesitation. "Of course. We're in this together, remember?" A ghost of a smile touched Alexander's lips. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. For a moment they stood there, drawing strength from each other's presence. The moment was broken by Sophie's cheerful voice calling from the kitchen. "Mommy, Mr. Alexander, I made toast." They pulled apart, a shared look of affection passing between them at the little girl's announcement. "We'd better go fuel up for battle," Alexander said, his voice lighter than it had been all morning. As they joined Sophie for breakfast, Olivia marveled at how naturally Alexander interacted with her daughter, helping her spread jam on her toast and listening intently to her chatter about school. It struck her then with a clarity that took her breath away, how much of a family they had become. The ride to Rothschild Global Investments was tense, the air in the car thick with unspoken anxiety. Olivia reached across the seat, taking Alexander's hand in hers. He gripped it tightly, as if it were a lifeline. As they entered the imposing building, Olivia felt the weight of eyes upon them. Whispers followed in their wake as they made their way to the executive floor. It was clear that news of the emergency board meeting had spread, and speculation was rife. Outside the boardroom, they paused. Alexander turned to Olivia, his eyes searching her face. "Whatever happens in there," he said softly, "I want you to know that meeting you, being with you and Sophie, it's changed everything for me. You've given me a purpose beyond just profit margins and stock prices." Olivia felt tears prick at her eyes. She reached up, cupping Alexander's face in her hands. "And you've given us a home, a family. We'll face whatever comes together." For a moment, it seemed as if Alexander might say more, might finally put into words the emotions that had been building between them. But then the boardroom doors opened, and the moment was lost. Cornelius Rothschild stood in the doorway, his piercing gaze taking in the scene before him. His eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of Olivia, but his voice was coldly polite when he spoke. "Alexander, Mrs. Rothschild, please join us." As they entered the boardroom, Olivia was struck by the palpable tension in the air. The board members sat around the long table, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. At the head of the table, Cornelius took his seat, every inch the powerful patriarch. "Now then," Cornelius began, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I've called this emergency meeting to address some concerns about the current direction of Rothschild Global Investments." Alexander straightened in his chair, his jaw set. "And what concerns would those be, Father?" Cornelius's eyes narrowed. "The fact that under your leadership, we've seen a marked decrease in short-term profits. Your focus on so-called ethical investments and community initiatives is undermining the very foundation of this company." "On the contrary," Alexander countered, his voice steady, "these initiatives are positioning us for long-term growth and stability. The market is changing and we need to change with it." As the debate raged on, Olivia watched the board members closely. Some nodded along with Alexander's points, while others frowned in concern at Cornelius's dire predictions. It was clear that the room was divided. Then Cornelius played his trump card. "I've prepared a detailed report," he said, gesturing to the folders in front of each board member, "outlining the potential risks of Alexander's strategies. I believe you'll find the projections troubling." As the board members began to flip through the report, murmurs of concern filled the room. Olivia could see Alexander's confidence wavering, his arguments faltering in the face of his father's meticulous planning. In that moment, Olivia knew she had to act. She couldn't sit silently by and watch Alexander's dreams, their dreams, be dismantled. "If I may," she said, her voice clear and strong. All eyes turned to her, surprise evident on many faces. Cornelius's expression darkened, but he nodded curtly for her to continue. Olivia took a deep breath, drawing on all the strength and determination that had seen her through years of single motherhood and struggle. "These projections," she began, "are based on outdated models. They don't take into account the changing attitudes of consumers, particularly younger generations." She stood, moving to the front of the room with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I come from a world very different from yours," she continued, "a world where people are increasingly concerned about the ethics of the companies they support. Alexander's vision isn't just morally right, it's economically smart." As she spoke, Olivia could see the board members listening intently. She shared anecdotes from her own experiences, painting a vivid picture of the real-world impact of corporate decisions. She talked about the bakery project, how it had already begun to transform a neighborhood. "What Alexander is proposing," she concluded, her eyes meeting his across the room, "is a future where Rothschild Global doesn't just make money, but makes a difference. It's a future I believe in. And I think, if you look beyond the short-term numbers, you'll see it's a future worth investing in. As Olivia retook her seat, a charged silence fell over the room. Alexander reached under the table, squeezing her hand in silent gratitude. Cornelius's expression was thunderous, but before he could speak, one of the board members cleared her throat. "I think," the woman said slowly, "that Mrs. Rothschild has raised some valid points. Perhaps we've been too hasty in our judgments." A murmur of agreement ran through the room. Olivia could see the tide turning, the doubt in people's eyes being replaced by consideration, even excitement. Cornelius, sensing he was losing control of the situation, stood abruptly. "This is preposterous," he snapped. "Are we really going to let the naive idealism of a baker sway the future of this company?" His words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive. But instead of the agreement he clearly expected, Cornelius was met with frowns of disapproval. Alexander stood then, his voice quiet but firm. "That baker," he said, "has shown more insight into the future of business than anyone in this room. She represents the very people we should be considering in our decisions. If that's naive idealism, then perhaps it's exactly what this company needs." The room erupted into discussion, board members debating animatedly amongst themselves. As the conversation flowed around them, Alexander and Olivia shared a look of cautious hope. Whatever the outcome, they had made their stand together. As the meeting stretched into its third hour, the shape of Rothschild Global's future began to emerge. It was a compromise, a careful balance between tradition and innovation, but it was a future that bore the unmistakable stamp of Alexander's vision and Olivia's influence. When the final vote was tallied, Alexander's leadership was affirmed, albeit with the caveat of closer board oversight. As the meeting adjourned, Cornelius stormed out without a word, his face a mask of barely contained fury. In the aftermath, as board members filed out, offering congratulations and handshakes, Alexander and Olivia found themselves alone in the boardroom. Without a word, Alexander pulled Olivia into a fierce embrace. "We did it," he whispered into her hair. "You did it." "Olivia, you were amazing." Olivia clung to him, the adrenaline of the past few hours finally giving way to exhaustion and relief. "We did it together," she said softly. As they stood there, holding each other in the quiet of the boardroom, both were acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted. The lines between their arranged marriage and genuine partnership had blurred beyond recognition. But even as they reveled in their victory, neither was naive enough to believe that Cornelius would accept defeat gracefully. As they left the boardroom hand in hand, they were unaware of the storm that was brewing. A storm that would test not just their business acumen, but the very foundation of the bond they had forged. The crucible had been survived, but the true test was yet to come. The days following the tumultuous board meeting passed in a whirlwind of activity. Alexander threw himself into implementing his new vision for Rothschild Global, while Olivia divided her time between final preparations for the bakery's grand opening and supporting Alexander in his endeavors. The penthouse buzzed with a newfound energy, a sense of purpose and shared excitement that seemed to infuse every moment. It was on a crisp Saturday morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, that the first ripples of change began to make themselves felt. Alexander stood at the counter, attempting to flip pancakes under Sophie's watchful eye, while Olivia brewed coffee and checked her phone for any last-minute messages about the bakery's opening, scheduled for the following week. "Mr. Alexander," Sophie giggled. "I think that one's supposed to be round, not splat-shaped." Alexander mock-frowned at the misshapen pancake on the spatula. "I'll have you know, young lady, that in certain very exclusive culinary circles, splat-shaped is all the rage." Olivia watched the interaction with a warmth blooming in her chest. The sight of Alexander, still in his pajamas, hair mussed from sleep, joking easily with her daughter, struck her with an almost physical force. This was what she had always dreamed of: a family, a partnership, a home filled with laughter and love. The moment was interrupted by the sharp ring of the doorbell. Alexander and Olivia exchanged a puzzled glance. They weren't expecting anyone, and visitors to the penthouse were rare. "I'll get it," Olivia said, setting down her coffee mug. She opened the door to find a courier, holding a thick envelope. "Delivery for Alexander Rothschild, the young man said, handing over the package. Olivia thanked him and closed the door, a sense of unease settling over her as she examined the envelope. The return address was that of Cornelius Rothschild's personal lawyer. "Alexander," she called, her voice tight, "I think you need to see this." Alexander appeared in the hallway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. His eyes narrowed as he saw the envelope. "Is that from—" Olivia nodded, handing it over. "Your father's lawyer, it seems." With a deep breath, Alexander tore open the envelope. As he read the contents, his face drained of color. "No," he muttered. "He can't. This isn't possible." "Alexander!" Olivia stepped closer, concern etched on her features. "What is it?" He looked up at her, his eyes a storm of emotions, anger, fear, disbelief. "It's a lawsuit," he said, his voice hollow. "My father is suing for control of the company. He's claiming that I'm mentally unfit to lead, that my recent decisions are evidence of instability." Olivia felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. "He can't do that," she said, reaching for Alexander's hand. "The board just voted to support your leadership." Alexander's laugh was bitter. "Apparently he thinks he can, and he's not stopping there." He flipped to the next page, his jaw clenching. "He's also petitioning to have our marriage annulled, claiming it was entered into under false pretenses, and has unduly influenced my business decisions." The weight of Cornelius's actions hung heavy in the air between them. This wasn't just a business maneuver. It was a direct attack on the life they had built together, on the family they had become. "Mommy, Mr. Alexander?" Sophie's small voice came from the kitchen doorway. "Is everything okay?" Olivia turned, forcing a smile onto her face. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Why don't you go watch some cartoons while we finish breakfast?" As Sophie padded off to the living room, Olivia turned back to Alexander. He stood rigid, the papers crumpled in his fist, his eyes unfocused as he stared at nothing. "Alexander?" Olivia said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "Look at me." Slowly he raised his eyes to meet hers. The vulnerability she saw there made her heart ache. "We will fight this," she said, her voice low and intense. "Together. Your father doesn't get to decide who we are or what we mean to each other." For a long moment, Alexander was silent. Then slowly the tension began to leave his body. He unclenched his fist, letting the crumpled papers fall to the floor, and pulled Olivia into a tight embrace. "I can't lose you," he whispered into her hair. "You and Sophie. You're everything to me now. I don't care about the company, about the Rothschild name. I care about us." Olivia held him tightly, her own eyes filling with tears. "You won't lose us," she promised. "No matter what your father does, we're a family now. That's not something he can take away with lawyers and lawsuits." As they stood there, holding each other in the quiet of the hallway, both were acutely aware of how far they had come. What had started as an arrangement, a business deal, had grown into something real, something precious. And now they would have to fight to protect it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and strategy sessions. Alexander was in constant contact with the company's legal team, while Olivia reached out to her own network of friends and contacts, seeking advice and support. As evening fell, they found themselves on the balcony, looking out over the city. Sophie was asleep, the penthouse quiet save for the distant sounds of traffic below. "What are you thinking?" Olivia asked, watching Alexander's profile in the fading light. He was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the back of her hand. "I'm thinking," he said finally, "about the first time I saw you. In that boardroom, looking so out of place, and yet so determined. I thought my father was cruel, forcing this arrangement on us both." He turned to her then, his eyes intense. "I never imagined I'd be standing here, months later, grateful for his manipulation. Because without it, I might never have known you, Olivia. I might never have understood what it means to have a real partner, a real family." Olivia felt her breath catch in her throat. "Alexander," she began, but he shook his head, silencing her. "Let me finish," he said softly. "I need you to know this. Whatever happens with the company, with my father's lawsuit, with any of it, none of that matters to me as much as you and Sophie. You've shown me what really matters in life, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away." As the last light faded from the sky, Alexander and Olivia stood together on the balcony, their fingers intertwined, facing an uncertain future. But in that moment, both felt a sense of certainty, not about what challenges lay ahead, but about the strength of the bond between them. The ripples from Cornelius's actions would continue to spread, threatening to upend the life they had built. But as they stood there, together in the gathering darkness, Alexander and Olivia made a silent vow. They would face whatever came next as they had faced everything else, together as a family, united against the storm. Little did they know that the true test of their bond was yet to come, as Cornelius Rothschild prepared to unleash forces that would shake the very foundations of their world. The following weeks unfolded like a high-stakes chess match, with Cornelius Rothschild and his team of lawyers making aggressive moves, while Alexander and Olivia scrambled to defend their position. The once peaceful penthouse had transformed into a war room, with legal documents strewn across every surface and a constant stream of calls from lawyers, board members, and concerned employees. Amidst this chaos, Olivia stood in the newly opened bakery, Sweet Foundations, trying to focus on a customer's order. The grand opening had been a success, despite the dark cloud hanging over their personal lives. The aroma of freshly baked bread and coffee filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that seemed to permeate every other aspect of their lives. As she handed over a box of carefully selected pastries, Olivia caught sight of a familiar figure through the shop window. Her heart sank as she recognized one of Cornelius's lawyers, accompanied by what appeared to be a private investigator. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. The bell above the door chimed as Alexander entered, his tie loosened and dark circles under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. He made his way to the counter, offering Olivia a weak smile. "How's business?" he asked, his voice low. Olivia reached across the counter, squeezing his hand. "Steady, but we have company," she murmured, nodding towards the window. Alexander's jaw tightened as he spotted the men outside. "They're getting bolder," he muttered. "I'm sorry, Olivia. I never meant for you to be caught in the crossfire like this." Olivia shook her head firmly. "Don't apologize. We're in this together, remember?" "How did the meeting with the board go?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Olivia had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "It was tense. My father's accusations have some of them spooked. They're starting to question everything, second-guessing decisions we made weeks ago." Before Olivia could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Thompson, Sophie's caretaker. She read it quickly, her brow furrowing with concern. "What is it?" Alexander asked, noting her expression. Olivia sighed heavily. "Sophie's school called. Apparently some of the other children have been saying things. About us, about the lawsuit. Mrs. Thompson had to pick her up early." Alexander's face fell, guilt washing over his features. "God, Olivia, I'm so sorry." "Sophie shouldn't have to deal with this. None of you should." Olivia came around the counter, pulling Alexander into a quiet corner of the shop. "Listen to me," she said firmly, cupping his face in her hands. "This is not your fault. Your father is the one doing this, not you. We will get through this." For a moment, Alexander leaned into her touch, drawing strength from her presence. Then, straightening up, he nodded. "You're right. We should go home, talk to Sophie together." As they left the bakery, Olivia couldn't help but notice the way Alexander placed himself between her and Cornelius's men, his body language protective and defiant. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about how their relationship had evolved. Back at the penthouse, they found Sophie curled up on the couch, her usual vibrant energy subdued. Mrs. Thompson gave them a sympathetic look as she gathered her things to leave. "Hey, sweetheart," Olivia said softly, sitting beside her daughter. "Do you want to talk about what happened at school?" Sophie looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Why are people saying mean things about us, Mommy? About you and Mr. Alexander?" Alexander knelt in front of the couch, his heart breaking at the confusion and hurt in Sophie's voice. "Sometimes, Sophie," he began carefully, "grown-ups disagree about things, and sometimes they don't handle those disagreements very well. But I want you to know that none of this is your fault or your mum's fault." "Is it your fault?" Sophie asked innocently, her gaze fixed on Alexander. He hesitated, the weight of guilt threatening to overwhelm him. But before he could respond, Olivia jumped in. "No, honey, it's not Alexander's fault either. Sometimes families have problems, but that doesn't mean anyone is to blame." What matters is that we stick together and support each other. That's what real families do. Sophie seemed to consider this for a moment. Then, in a move that surprised both adults, she climbed into Alexander's lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "We're a real family, right?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Alexander felt a lump form in his throat as he hugged Sophie back. "Yes," he said softly, meeting Olivia's eyes over the little girl's head. "We're a real family." Later that night, after Sophie had been tucked into bed with extra stories and reassurances, Alexander and Olivia sat at the kitchen island, an array of legal documents spread out before them. "We need to talk about our next move," Alexander said, his voice weary but determined. "My father's not going to back down easily. He's already started reaching out to major shareholders, trying to sway them to his side." Olivia nodded, her mind racing. "What about the ethical investment initiatives you started? And the community outreach programs? Surely there must be data showing their positive impact by now." Alexander's eyes lit up slightly. "You're right. It's still early, but the preliminary numbers are promising. If we can show that these programs are not just morally right but financially sound." As they pored over reports and strategized late into the night, both were acutely aware of the stakes. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about protecting the life they had built together, the family they had become. In the quiet hours of the early morning, as they finally prepared for bed, Alexander caught Olivia's hand, pulling her close. "Olivia," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know something. No matter what happens with the company, with my father, with any of it, you and Sophie are what matter most to me now. If I had to choose between the Rothschild empire and our family, I'd choose you, every time." Olivia felt tears prick at her eyes as she leaned into Alexander's embrace. "We're not going to let it come to that," she whispered fiercely. "We're going to fight, and we're going to win. Together." As they held each other in the darkness of their bedroom, both Alexander and Olivia were aware that the coming days would test them like never before. The siege laid by Cornelius Rothschild was only beginning, and the battles ahead would challenge not just their business acumen, but the very foundation of their relationship. But in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms, they found strength in their unity. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would weather them as they had everything else, together, as a family, bound by a love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings. Little did they know that Cornelius had yet to play his most devastating card, a revelation that would shake Alexander to his core and test the limits of Olivia's commitment to their newfound family. The early morning light filtered through the windows of the Rothschild penthouse, casting long shadows across the living room where Alexander sat, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. He had been up most of the night, poring over financial reports and correspondence, searching for anything that might give them an edge in the upcoming legal battle. Olivia found him there as she emerged from the bedroom, hair tousled from sleep, concern etched on her face. "Have you been up all night?" she asked softly, moving to stand behind him and placing her hands on his tense shoulders. Alexander leaned back into her touch, exhaling deeply. "I couldn't sleep. There's something we're missing, Olivia. Some piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit." Before Olivia could respond, Alexander's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing. "It's from an unknown number," he murmured, opening the message. As he read, his face paled visibly. Olivia felt his shoulders tense beneath her hands. "Alexander, what is it?" He handed her the phone wordlessly. On the screen was a cryptic message. "If you want to understand your father's true motivations, look into the Hawthorne merger of 1989. Not everything is as it seems. A friend." Olivia frowned, puzzled. "The Hawthorne merger. What does that mean?" Alexander shook his head, his mind racing. "I'm not sure. It was before my time, one of my father's early big deals. But why would it be relevant now?" As if in answer to his question, there was a sharp knock at the door. Both of them froze, exchanging wary glances. It was barely 7 a.m., far too early for a social call. Alexander moved to answer it, Olivia close behind him. As he opened the door, they found themselves face to face with a petite, elderly woman, her silver hair neatly coiffed, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Alexander said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" The woman's eyes flicked between Alexander and Olivia, a hint of sadness in their depths. "I think it's time we had a talk, Alexander. About your father, about the past, and about your mother." The next hour passed in a blur as Mrs. Hawthorne, Margaret as she insisted they call her, unfolded a tale that left both Alexander and Olivia reeling. "Your father wasn't always the man he is now," Margaret began, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee as they sat in the living room. "Back in '89, he was ambitious, yes, but he had principles. The merger between Rothschild and Hawthorne Industries was supposed to be a partnership of equals." Alexander leaned forward, his attention rapt. "What changed?" Margaret's expression darkened. "Your grandfather happened. He saw the merger as a chance for a hostile takeover. He pressured Cornelius to betray the terms we had agreed upon, to push for complete control." "And my father went along with it?" Alexander asked, disbelief coloring his voice. Margaret shook her head slowly. "Not at first. That's where your mother comes in." Olivia reached for Alexander's hand as she saw him tense at the mention of his mother. She knew it was a sensitive subject. Alexander's mother had passed away when he was young, and Cornelius rarely spoke of her. "Elizabeth, your mother, she was the voice of reason," Margaret continued. She urged Cornelius to stand up to his father, to honor the original agreement. For a while it seemed like he might. "What happened?" Olivia asked softly, sensing they were approaching the crux of the matter. Margaret's eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and old anger. Cornelius's father made a choice for him. He threatened to disown Cornelius, to cut him off completely if he didn't go through with the takeover. And more than that, he threatened to ruin Elizabeth's family financially. Alexander's grip on Olivia's hand tightened. "So my father chose the company over his principles." Margaret nodded. "The takeover went through. Hawthorne Industries was absorbed into Rothschild Global, but the cost—" She trailed off, her gaze distant. "The cost?" Alexander prompted, though part of him dreaded the answer. Margaret's eyes refocused on Alexander, filled with sympathy. "Your mother never forgave Cornelius for giving in to his father's demands. She saw it as a betrayal of everything they had believed in together. It created a rift between them that never truly healed." The room fell into a heavy silence as the weight of this revelation settled over them. Alexander sat very still, his face a mask of shock and dawning understanding. Olivia, her heart aching for the pain she saw in Alexander's eyes, turned to Margaret. "Why are you telling us this now?" The older woman sighed. "Because history is repeating itself, my dear. Cornelius is becoming the very thing he once despised, a man who values power and control over integrity and family. I couldn't stand by and watch another generation of Rothschilds be torn apart by this toxic legacy." As Margaret prepared to leave, she pressed a small USB drive into Alexander's hand. "Everything I've told you, plus more. Financial records, correspondence from that time. Use it wisely, Alexander. And remember, you're not your father and you don't have to make his mistakes." After she had gone, Alexander and Olivia sat in stunned silence, the USB drive lying between them on the coffee table like a live grenade. "Alexander," Olivia said softly, breaking the silence. "Are you okay?" He looked up at her, his eyes a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion. "I don't know," he admitted. "All my life I thought I knew who my father was, who I was supposed to be, but this—" Olivia moved closer, wrapping her arms around him. "This changes how you see him, but it doesn't change who you are, Alexander. You've already proven that you're different. You've chosen a different path." Alexander leaned into her embrace, drawing strength from her presence. "Have I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or am I just fooling myself?" Olivia pulled back slightly, framing his face with her hands and forcing him to meet her gaze. "Listen to me. The man I know, the man I've come to care for deeply, is nothing like the Cornelius in that story. You've stood up for what you believe in even when it was difficult. You've put family, our family, first." As her words sank in, Alexander felt a shift within himself. The shock and confusion began to give way to a steely determination. He reached for the USB drive, his decision made. "You're right," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not my father. And it's time I proved that to everyone, including him." As they began to formulate a plan, poring over the documents Margaret had provided, both Alexander and Olivia were acutely aware that they were standing on the precipice of a major turning point. The revelations about Cornelius's past had changed the game entirely, providing them with powerful ammunition in their legal battle. But more than that, it had given Alexander a new perspective on his father, on the company and on his own place in the Rothschild legacy. As he worked side by side with Olivia, strategizing late into the night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit anymore. It was about breaking a cycle, about forging a new path for the Rothschild name, one built on integrity, compassion, and the strength of family bonds. As the night wore on and their plans took shape, neither Alexander nor Olivia could shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something momentous. The battle ahead would be fierce, but together, they felt ready to face whatever challenges lay in store. Little did they know that Cornelius, backed into a corner, was preparing to make his most desperate and dangerous move yet, one that would test the limits of their love and loyalty in ways they could never have anticipated. The Rothschild Global Investments building loomed before Alexander and Olivia, its glass facade reflecting the early morning sun. They stood hand in hand on the sidewalk, both acutely aware of the significance of the day ahead. In Alexander's briefcase lay the evidence that could change everything, the documents and records provided by Margaret Hawthorne, detailing Cornelius's past transgressions. "Are you ready for this?" Olivia asked, giving Alexander's hand a reassuring squeeze. He took a deep breath, his jaw set with determination. "As ready as I'll ever be. Thank you for being here with me." As they made their way through the lobby, heads turned and whispers followed in their wake. The tension in the air was palpable. Word of an emergency board meeting had spread quickly, and speculation was rife. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent, both lost in their own thoughts. Alexander mentally rehearsed his presentation, while Olivia steeled herself for the confrontation to come. As the doors opened, they were met by Alexander's assistant, looking harried. "Mr. Rothschild, Mrs. Rothschild," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The board is already assembled. Your father, he's making some sort of announcement." Alexander's eyes widened in alarm. "What? The meeting wasn't supposed to start for another hour." Without waiting for a response, he strode towards the boardroom, Olivia close on his heels. As they approached, they could hear Cornelius's voice, commanding and self-assured, drifting through the partially open door. "And so, in light of recent events and for the good of the company, I am proposing a complete restructuring of leadership, effective immediately." Alexander pushed the door open, causing all heads to turn. Cornelius paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of his son and daughter-in-law. "Ah, Alexander," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "How kind of you to join us. We were just discussing the future of Rothschild Global." "I'm sure you were, Father," Alexander replied, his tone level despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "But I'm afraid your plans for the future may need some revision." He moved to the front of the room, Olivia taking a seat at the back, her presence a silent support. Alexander opened his briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents. "Before we continue with any discussions about restructuring," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the room, "there's something the board needs to see, something that sheds light on the true history of Rothschild Global and the man who claims to have its best interests at heart." Cornelius's face darkened. "Alexander, this is neither the time nor the place for— on the contrary, Father." Alexander cut him off, his voice sharp. "This is exactly the time and place. For too long, decisions have been made in this company based on half-truths and manipulations. That ends today." Over the next hour, Alexander laid out the evidence provided by Margaret Hawthorne. He detailed the true nature of the 1989 merger, the ethical compromises made, and the personal cost to his family. As he spoke, he could see the shock and disbelief on the faces of the board members. Some looked angry, others disappointed, but all were riveted by the revelations. Cornelius sat silent throughout, his face a mask of stone. But Olivia, watching closely, could see the subtle signs of his growing desperation, the tightening of his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on his armrests. As Alexander concluded his presentation, the room erupted into chaos. Board members argued amongst themselves. some demanding explanations from Cornelius, others calling for an immediate vote on leadership. Amidst the uproar, Cornelius stood slowly, his eyes fixed on Alexander. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, loud enough for only Alexander and those nearest to hear. "You think exposing old history changes anything? You have no idea what you've just done, boy." Before Alexander could respond, Cornelius turned on his heel and strode out of the boardroom, pushing past a startled Olivia on his way out. The next few hours passed in a blur of discussions, votes, and hastily called legal consultations. By the time the dust settled, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The board, shaken by the revelations and impressed by Alexander's handling of the situation, voted overwhelmingly to support his continued leadership and vision for the company. As the last of the board members filed out, offering congratulations and words of support, Alexander finally allowed himself to slump into a chair, the weight of the day catching up with him. Olivia moved to his side, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder. "You did it," she said softly, pride evident in her voice. Alexander looked up at her, a mix of exhaustion and relief on his face. "We did it," he corrected her. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Olivia." As they prepared to leave, Alexander's assistant appeared at the door, her face pale. "Mr. Rothschild," she said hesitantly, "there's something you need to see." She handed him a tablet open to a breaking news story. The headline made Alexander's blood run cold. "Rothschild heirs marriage of convenience. Insider reveals all." The article, clearly fed by sources close to Cornelius, detailed the arranged nature of Alexander and Olivia's marriage, painting it as a cynical business move rather than a genuine relationship. Olivia, reading over Alexander's shoulder, felt her heart sink. "He's trying to discredit us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "to make it look like everything we've done, everything we've said, is part of some elaborate scheme." Alexander's jaw clenched, anger and hurt warring in his eyes. "I'll issue a statement, we'll fight this." But Olivia shook her head, cutting him off. "No, Alexander, don't you see? This is exactly what he wants. To drag us into a public battle, to keep us on the defensive." She took the tablet from his hands, setting it aside, and then took both of his hands in hers. "We know the truth. About how we started, yes, but more importantly, about what we've become. No statement, no public denial can prove that. We can only live it." As her words sank in, Alexander felt a shift within himself. The anger began to subside, replaced by a deep, unwavering certainty. He pulled Olivia close, wrapping his arms around her. "You're right," he murmured into her hair. "Let them say what they want. We know who we are, what we mean to each other. That's all that matters." As they left the Rothschild building that evening, hand in hand, both were acutely aware that the battle was far from over. Cornelius's desperate move had raised the stakes, bringing their personal lives into the spotlight in a way they had never anticipated. But as they stepped out into the bustling New York street, facing an uncertain future together, neither Alexander nor Olivia felt afraid. They had weathered storms before, had built something real and precious from the most unlikely of beginnings. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had everything else, together united by a love that had grown stronger with every test. Little did they know that Cornelius, backed into a corner and more dangerous than ever, was preparing a final devastating move, one that would target not just their public image, but the very heart of their newfound family. The days following the explosive board meeting and Cornelius's retaliatory news leak passed in a whirlwind of activity. Alexander and Olivia found themselves at the center of a media storm, their faces plastered across newspapers and gossip websites, their relationship dissected and analyzed by strangers. Olivia stood at the window of the penthouse, watching the street below where a small group of paparazzi had taken up seemingly permanent residence. She sighed, turning back to where Alexander sat on the couch, his laptop open before him, scanning the latest news articles. "Anything new?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Alexander shook his head, his expression grim. "Just more speculation. Some financial analysts questioning the stability of Rothschild Global, others digging into your background." He paused, meeting her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Olivia. You don't deserve any of this." Olivia moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Neither do you, Alexander. We're in this together, remember?" Before he could respond, Olivia's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen, her heart sinking as she recognized the number of Sophie's school. "Hello?" she answered, trying to keep the worry from her voice. As she listened, her face fell. Alexander watched, concern etched on his features. When she hung up, Olivia looked at him with tears in her eyes. "That was Sophie's teacher," she said softly. "Some of the other parents have been asking questions, saying things in front of the children. They want us to come in for a meeting." Alexander's jaw clenched, anger flashing in his eyes. "This has gone too far," he said, standing abruptly. "It's one thing for them to come after us, but Sophie, she's innocent in all this." Olivia stood as well, placing a calming hand on his arm. "I know, but getting angry won't help. We need to handle this carefully for Sophie's sake." Alexander took a deep breath, nodding. "You're right, of course. We'll go together, present a united front." As they prepared to leave for the school, Olivia couldn't help but marvel at how naturally Alexander had stepped into a parental role. Despite the chaos swirling around them, his concern for Sophie's well-being was genuine and unwavering. The meeting at the school was tense, with the principal and Sophie's teacher treading carefully around the subject of the media reports. Alexander and Olivia listened as they were told about the whispers in the hallways, the uncomfortable questions from other children, the concerns raised by some parents. "We understand this is a difficult situation," the principal said, her tone sympathetic but firm. "But we have to consider the impact on all our students. Perhaps it might be best if Sophie took some time away from school, just until things settle down." Olivia felt a surge of protective anger. "You want us to pull her out of school? To disrupt her education and isolate her from her friends because of gossip and speculation?" Alexander placed a steadying hand on Olivia's back, but his own voice was steel when he spoke. "Sophie has done nothing wrong. She shouldn't be punished for the actions of others. Instead of asking us to remove her, perhaps the school should focus on educating the other parents and children about the harm of gossip and judgment." The principal looked taken aback by their united front. After some further discussion, it was agreed that Sophie would remain in school, with additional support provided to help her navigate any difficult situations. As they left the school, both Alexander and Olivia felt drained but resolute. They had faced the first real test of their family unit and had come through it stronger. "Thank you," Olivia said softly as they walked to their car, "for standing up for Sophie, for being there." Alexander squeezed her hand. "Always," he replied, the single word carrying the weight of a promise. Back at the penthouse, they found Mrs. Thompson, their nanny, attempting to distract Sophie with a board game. The little girl's usual bubbly energy was subdued, and she looked up as they entered with worried eyes. "Mommy, Mr. Alexander, are we in trouble?" she asked, her voice small. Olivia's heart broke at the uncertainty in her daughter's voice. She knelt down, pulling Sophie into a tight hug. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. Some people are just saying silly things, but it doesn't change anything about our family." Alexander joined them, his hand coming to rest on Sophie's shoulder. "That's right," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "No matter what anyone says, we're a family. And families stick together." As they spent the evening together playing games and making plans for the weekend, all three felt a sense of peace descend. The outside world, with its judgments and speculations, seemed far away. Later that night, after Sophie had been tucked into bed with extra stories and reassurances, Alexander and Olivia found themselves on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. "We should get away for a while," Alexander said suddenly. "Take Sophie somewhere quiet, away from all this media circus." Olivia looked at him surprised. "What about the company? The bakery?" Alexander shook his head. "They'll manage without us for a few days. This," he gestured between them. "Us, our family, it's what's most important. I think we need some time to just be together, without all the outside noise." As Olivia considered his words, she felt a warmth bloom in her chest. This man who had entered her life as part of a business arrangement had become someone she couldn't imagine her life without. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said softly, leaning into him. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Both felt a sense of calm settle over them. The storm of public opinion and media scrutiny still raged around them, but here, in this moment, they were in the eye of that storm, a place of peace and clarity. Little did they know that as they made plans for a family getaway, Cornelius Rothschild was setting in motion a plan that would strike at the very heart of their newfound happiness. The calm they felt was merely the prelude to a tempest that would test their bond like never before. As the city hummed below them, Alexander and Olivia held each other close, drawing strength from their connection. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family united by love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, as Alexander guided their rented SUV along the winding mountain road. Beside him, Olivia dozed lightly, her head resting against the window. In the back seat, Sophie was curled up with her favorite stuffed animal, lost in peaceful slumber. They had left New York in the early hours of the morning, eager to escape the constant scrutiny and pressure that had become their daily reality. Alexander had chosen a secluded cabin in the Adirondacks, far from the reach of paparazzi lenses and probing questions. As the car rounded a bend, a breathtaking view of a pristine lake surrounded by dense forest came into view. Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders at the sight. Here, miles away from boardrooms and news cycles, they could just be a family. "Olivia," he said softly, reaching over to gently shake her awake. "We're almost there." "Look." Olivia stirred, her eyes widening as she took in the scenery. "Oh, Alexander," she breathed. "It's beautiful." The cabin, when they arrived, was everything they had hoped for. Rustic, yet comfortable, with a large deck overlooking the lake. As Alexander and Olivia unloaded the car, Sophie woke up, her excitement quickly overcoming any lingering sleepiness. "Can we go to the lake?" "Can we please?" she begged, bouncing on her toes. Olivia laughed, the sound light and carefree in a way it hadn't been for weeks. "Let's get settled first, sweetie, then we have the whole day for exploring." As they unpacked and explored their temporary home, all three felt the tensions of the past weeks begin to melt away. Here there were no pressing emails to answer, no reporters to dodge, no whispers to ignore. It was just them, the sun, and the promise of days filled with simple pleasures. The next few days passed in a blissful blur. They went hiking, Alexander and Olivia hand in hand, while Sophie ran ahead, pointing out interesting rocks and flowers. They spent lazy afternoons by the lake, teaching Sophie to skip stones and building sandcastles on the small beach. On their third evening, as they sat around a campfire roasting marshmallows, Sophie looked up at Alexander with wide, serious eyes. "Mr. Alexander," she said, her voice hesitant, "are you my daddy now?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Alexander felt his heart race as he glanced at Olivia, searching her face for guidance. What he saw there, love, trust, and a slight nod of encouragement, gave him the courage to answer. "Sophie," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I would be honored to be your daddy if that's what you want. I love you and your mom very much." Sophie's face broke into a radiant smile. She launched herself at Alexander, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "I want that," she whispered. "I love you too, Daddy." As Alexander held Sophie close, his eyes met Olivia's over the little girl's head. The love and gratitude he saw there made his heart swell. In that moment, under the star-studded sky, they were no longer an arranged marriage or a blended family finding their way. They were simply that, a family bound by love and choice. Later that night, after Sophie had been tucked into bed, Alexander and Olivia stood on the deck, looking out over the moonlit lake. "Did you mean it?" Olivia asked softly. "What you said to Sophie?" Alexander turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Every word," he said, his voice fervent. "Olivia, I know our start was unconventional, to say the least, but these past months getting to know you, falling in love with you and Sophie, it's been the most real, most meaningful thing in my life." Olivia felt tears prick at her eyes. "Alexander, But before she could finish, Alexander dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Olivia Martinez," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I know we're already married on paper, but I want to do this right. I want to marry you for real. Not because of any arrangement or expectation, but because I love you. Will you marry me again, for all the right reasons this time?" Olivia's hand flew to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, a beautiful, understated diamond that was worlds away from the ostentatious piece that had been part of their original arrangement, they both felt a sense of rightness settle over them. This was how it was meant to be. Their kiss was sweet and full of promise, a seal on the vows they were making not just to each other, but to the life they were choosing to build together. However, even as Alexander and Olivia celebrated their renewed commitment, forces were at work to undermine their happiness. Back in New York, Cornelius Rothschild sat in his study, a glass of scotch in hand as he listened to the report from his private investigator. "So they've gone to ground," he mused, his voice cold. "No matter. Everything is in place." The investigator nodded. "Yes, sir. The documents have been planted. As soon as they return, the story will break." Cornelius allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Excellent. Let them enjoy their little family vacation. When they return, they'll find that the real storm is just beginning." As he dismissed the investigator, Cornelius turned to look out over the city he had spent a lifetime conquering. He felt a twinge of something, regret perhaps, but quickly suppressed it. There was too much at stake to allow sentiment to cloud his judgment now. Miles away, blissfully unaware of the machinations unfolding in their absence, Alexander and Olivia fell asleep in each other's arms, their dreams filled with visions of the future they planned to build together. The peace they had found in the mountains had strengthened their bond, preparing them for the challenges that lay ahead. Little did they know that their resolve would soon be tested in ways they could never have imagined, as Cornelius's final, desperate gambit threatened to tear apart everything they held dear. The New York skyline came into view as their car wound its way through the busy streets, a stark contrast to the peaceful wilderness they had left behind. Alexander, Olivia, and Sophie were returning from their idyllic mountain getaway, refreshed and united, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As they approached their building, Alexander noticed a commotion near the entrance. A small crowd of reporters and photographers had gathered, their cameras at the ready. "What on earth?" Olivia murmured, instinctively reaching back to place a protective hand on Sophie's knee. Alexander's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but I don't like it. Hold on." He directed the driver to the private underground entrance, bypassing the media frenzy. As they rode the elevator up to the penthouse, an uneasy silence fell over them. The bubble of peace they had created in the mountains was already beginning to feel like a distant dream. The moment they stepped into the penthouse, Alexander's phone began to buzz incessantly. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening as he scrolled through the notifications. "Alexander," Olivia asked, concern evident in her voice. "What is it?" He looked up, his eyes troubled. It's everywhere. Every major news outlet, social media. Olivia, they're saying I'm not Sophie's biological father." Olivia felt the blood drain from her face. "What? But that's impossible. We never claimed you were." Alexander nodded, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I know. But apparently there are leaked documents suggesting that we've been lying, that we've been trying to pass Sophie off as a Rothschild to strengthen our position in the company." Sophie, who had been quietly unpacking her backpack, looked up at the mention of her name. "Mommy, Daddy, what's wrong?" The word Daddy from Sophie's lips, so new and precious, made Alexander's heart clench. He knelt down to her level, forcing a smile. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. Some people are just saying silly things. Why don't you go unpack in your room? We'll be there to help in a minute." As Sophie skipped off to her room, Olivia turned to Alexander, her eyes wide with a mixture of anger and fear. "This has to be your father's doing, but why? What could he possibly hope to gain from this?" Before Alexander could respond, his phone rang. It was his assistant, her voice tight with urgency. "Mr. Rothschild, I'm so sorry to bother you, but there's an emergency board meeting being called. They're questioning your fitness to lead in light of these new allegations." Alexander felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "I understand. Tell them I'll be there in an hour." As he hung up, he turned to Olivia, his expression grim. "It's worse than we thought. The board is meeting to discuss my leadership. This isn't just about us anymore, Olivia. My father is trying to use this to take back control of the company. Olivia reached out, taking his hand in hers. Then we'll fight it, together. We have nothing to hide, Alexander. We've done nothing wrong. Alexander squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her unwavering support. You're right. But this fight, it's going to get ugly. Are you sure you're ready for that? Olivia's eyes flashed with determination. I've been through worse, Alexander. We both have. Whatever your father throws at us, we can handle it. We're family now, remember? As they stood there, hands clasped, both were acutely aware of the storm raging outside their doors. The peace and clarity they had found in the mountains seemed a lifetime ago, but the strength of their bond remained. Alexander pulled Olivia close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I love you, he murmured. Both of you. No matter what happens, that won't change. Olivia leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. I love you too. Now go, face the board. Show them the man I know you to be. As Alexander prepared to leave for the emergency board meeting, Olivia went to check on Sophie. She found her daughter sitting on her bed, clutching her favorite stuffed animal, her small face creased with worry. Mommy, Sophie said, her voice small, are people mad at us? Olivia's heart broke at the uncertainty in her daughter's voice. She sat down on the bed, pulling Sophie into her lap. Some people are saying unkind things, sweetheart, but that's their problem, not ours. We know the truth, and that's what matters. Sophie nodded, but her frown remained. But Alexander is my daddy now, right? Even if he wasn't before? Olivia felt tears prick at her eyes. Oh, honey, yes, Alexander is your daddy now. Family isn't just about blood, Sophie. It's about love and choice. And Alexander chose us, just like we chose him. Nothing anyone says can change that. As she held her daughter close, Olivia's mind raced with the challenges that lay ahead. She knew that the coming days would test them all, that the scrutiny and judgment of the outside world would be intense. But as she thought of Alexander, facing down the board with the same courage and integrity he had shown throughout their journey together, she felt a surge of determination. They had come too far, built too much together, to let Cornelius's machinations tear them apart now. Meanwhile, across town, Alexander stood outside the boardroom, steeling himself for the battle ahead. He thought of Olivia and Sophie, of the family they had become, of the love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings. With a deep breath, he pushed open the doors, ready to fight for everything that mattered. As the day wore on, the storm Cornelius had set in motion continued to gather strength. But in the eye of that storm, a family stood united, their bond tested but unbroken, ready to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did they know that Cornelius's plan had only begun to unfold, and that the true test of their love and loyalty was yet to come. The Rothschild Global Investments boardroom was a battlefield, and Alexander stood at its center, a general facing down an army of skeptics and potential mutineers. The air was thick with tension as he addressed the assembled board members, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, he began, his gaze sweeping the room. I know you've all been inundated with rumors and speculation. I'm here to set the record straight. As Alexander spoke, laying out the truth of his relationship with Olivia and Sophie, he could see the doubt in some eyes, the sympathy in others. But it was the calculating gleam in his father's gaze that truly chilled him. Cornelius sat at the far end of the table, his face an impassive mask. But Alexander knew his father well enough to recognize the satisfaction lurking behind that facade. This was the moment Cornelius had been waiting for, the culmination of his carefully orchestrated plan. Mr. Rothschild, one of the board members spoke up, her voice laced with concern. While we appreciate your candor, you must understand our position. The public perception of this situation could have serious repercussions for the company. Alexander nodded, acknowledging the point. I understand your concerns, but I would argue that how we handle this situation says more about our company's values than the situation itself. We have an opportunity here to show that Rothschild Global stands for integrity, for family, for the things that truly matter beyond profit margins and stock prices. As the debate raged on, with board members arguing back and forth, Alexander stood firm. He answered every question honestly, faced every accusation head-on. And with each passing moment, he could see the tide of opinion slowly beginning to turn. Meanwhile, across town, Olivia faced her own battle. The news of the alleged deception had spread quickly, and as she arrived at Sweet Foundations, her beloved bakery, she was met with a mix of curious stares and whispered comments from customers. She held her head high as she made her way to the back office, where she found her assistant, Maria, looking worried. "Olivia," Maria said, her voice low, "there are reporters outside. They're asking questions about you and Mr. Rothschild. What should I tell them?" Olivia took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Tell them the truth, Maria. That I'm here to work, to serve our community, just like always. Our personal lives are our own business." As she tied on her apron and began to prepare for the day's baking, Olivia felt a sense of calm settle over her. This bakery, this dream she had built with Alexander's support, was a testament to their partnership, to the life they had chosen to build together. No amount of gossip or speculation could take that away. Back in the boardroom, the meeting had stretched into its third hour. Alexander's throat was dry, his voice hoarse from speaking, but he refused to back down. As he finished addressing yet another concern, he noticed a shift in his father's demeanor. Cornelius leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. "I think," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "that we're overlooking a crucial point here. This isn't just about public perception or family drama. This is about judgment." The room fell silent as Cornelius continued. "If my son could be so easily manipulated in his personal life, swayed by emotion into making rash decisions, how can we trust his judgment when it comes to the future of this company?" Alexander felt a surge of anger, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "With all due respect, Mr. Rothschild," said Elizabeth Chen, one of the younger board members, "I think you're mischaracterizing the situation entirely." All eyes turned to Elizabeth as she continued. "What I see is a leader who has shown tremendous growth, who has demonstrated the ability to adapt, to form meaningful partnerships, to balance personal fulfillment with professional responsibility. Aren't these exactly the qualities we want in someone guiding our company into the future?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Alexander felt a glimmer of hope as he saw several board members nodding along with Elizabeth's words. As the meeting finally adjourned with no definitive action taken, but a clear shift in the board's attitude, Alexander felt both exhausted and cautiously optimistic. He had weathered the storm, at least for now. But as he prepared to leave, Cornelius approached him, his voice low and menacing. "This isn't over, son. You may have won them over today, but I promise you, by the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd never defied me." Alexander met his father's gaze steadily. "You're right about one thing, Father. This isn't over. But you've underestimated me, and you've underestimated the strength of my family. We're not going anywhere." As Alexander left the Rothschild building, his phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. "How did it go? Sophie and I are at the bakery. Come join us when you can. We love you." Reading those simple words, Alexander felt a wave of emotion wash over him. In the midst of all this chaos, he had found something real, something worth fighting for. He hailed a cab, giving the driver the address of Sweet Foundations. As the city rushed by outside the window, Alexander allowed himself a moment of reflection. The storm wasn't over. In fact, he suspected they were only in the eye of the hurricane, with more turbulence to come. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't facing the storms alone. He had Olivia's unwavering support, Sophie's innocent love, and a newfound confidence in his own abilities and values. As the cab pulled up in front of the bakery, Alexander could see Olivia through the window, flower on her cheek as she laughed with a customer. Sophie sat at a small table, her legs swinging as she concentrated on a coloring book. This, he realized, was what truly mattered. Not the boardrooms or the billion-dollar deals, but the simple, profound joy of being part of a family, of building a life filled with love and purpose. With a renewed sense of determination, Alexander stepped out of the cab and into the warm, fragrant air of the bakery. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family united by choice and strengthened by love. As he embraced Olivia and scooped Sophie up into his arms, Alexander knew that the real battle was just beginning. But with his family by his side, he felt ready for whatever Cornelius and fate might throw their way. The storm might rage on outside, but here, in this moment, they were the eye of their own hurricane, calm, centered, and unshakable in their love for each other. The crisp autumn air carried a sense of anticipation as Alexander straightened his tie, standing before the full-length mirror in their bedroom. Today was the day, the culmination of months of struggle, growth, and unwavering love. Today he and Olivia would renew their vows, not as part of a business arrangement, but as a true declaration of their love and commitment. "You look handsome," Olivia's voice came from behind him. He turned to see her, resplendent in a simple yet elegant white dress, Sophie at her side in a matching flower girl outfit. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. "And you both look absolutely beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As they made their way to Central Park, where a small gathering of their closest friends and supportive colleagues awaited, Alexander couldn't help but reflect on the tumultuous journey that had brought them to this moment. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal battles, public scrutiny, and personal triumphs. Cornelius had not given up easily, throwing everything he had at them in a desperate attempt to regain control. But Alexander, with Olivia by his side, had stood firm. They had faced every accusation with honesty and integrity, their unity unshakable in the face of adversity. Slowly but surely, public opinion had begun to turn in their favor. The final blow to Cornelius's plans had come just days ago, in a dramatic board meeting that would go down in Rothschild global history. Flashback to the board meeting. The tension in the room was palpable as Cornelius made his final play. "I have here," he announced, waving a folder dramatically, "irrefutable proof of Alexander's mismanagement and ethical breaches. Once you see this, you'll have no choice but to remove him from his position." But as he opened the folder, his face suddenly drained of color. The documents inside were not what he had expected. Instead, they detailed his own past transgressions, the true story of the Hawthorne merger, along with other ethically questionable decisions he had made over the years. Alexander stood, his voice calm but firm. "Father, I think it's time we put an end to this. The board deserves to know the truth, all of it." What followed was a frank, often painful discussion of the Rothschild legacy, both its triumphs and its darker chapters. Alexander laid bare the realities of growing up under Cornelius's impossible standards, the arranged marriage that had unexpectedly blossomed into love, and his vision for a company that balanced profit with ethical responsibility. As the meeting concluded, it was clear that a seismic shift had occurred. The board voted unanimously to support Alexander's continued leadership, with the stipulation that a new ethics committee be formed to ensure transparency and accountability at all levels of the company. Cornelius, his schemes finally laid bare, had no choice but to step down, his influence in the company he had built now little more than a shadow. As Alexander and Olivia exchanged their vows under the golden canopy of autumn leaves, the memory of that final confrontation seemed to fade away. Here, surrounded by the people they loved, nothing mattered but the promises they were making to each other. "Olivia," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly across the small gathering, "when we first met, I thought I knew everything about business, about success, about life. But you and Sophie have taught me what truly matters. You've shown me the strength that comes from vulnerability, the richness of a life filled with love and purpose. I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of the family we've built together." Olivia's eyes shimmered with tears as she responded, "Alexander, you came into our lives as part of an arrangement, but you've become the cornerstone of our family. Your love, your integrity, your unwavering support, they've given Sophie and me a home we never dreamed possible. I promise to stand by you, to face whatever life throws our way together, as partners and as family." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, cheers erupted from their gathered loved ones. Sophie bounced excitedly, throwing flower petals into the air. The reception that followed was a joyous affair, filled with laughter, heartfelt toasts, and the warm glow of new beginnings. As Alexander twirled Olivia on the dance floor, he caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the edge of the gathering. Cornelius stood there, looking older and more subdued than Alexander had ever seen him. Their eyes met across the space, decades of conflict and misunderstanding hanging between them. Then slowly, Cornelius gave a small nod, of acknowledgement, of respect, perhaps even of apology. Alexander returned the nod, feeling a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. He turned back to Olivia, pulling her close as they swayed to the music. "Everything okay?" she murmured, sensing the shift in his mood. Alexander smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Everything is perfect," he replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the celebration, Alexander, Olivia, and Sophie stood together, watching their guests mingle and dance. The challenges they had faced, the storms they had weathered, had only served to strengthen the bonds between them. "What happens now?" Sophie asked, looking up at her parents with curious eyes. Alexander and Olivia exchanged a smile. "Now," Olivia said, squeezing Alexander's hand, "we live our happily ever after, but not the kind in fairy tales where everything is perfect all the time." "No," Alexander agreed, lifting Sophie into his arms. "Our happily ever after is the real kind, where we face challenges together, where we learn and grow every day, where we build a life filled with love and purpose." As they stood there, a family united by choice and strengthened by love, the future stretched out before them. Not a smooth path, but a journey they were eager to embark on together. The Rothschild name would continue to be associated with success and influence, but under Alexander's leadership, it would come to stand for something more: integrity, compassion, and the unshakable bonds of family. And in a cozy bakery in the heart of New York, where the aroma of fresh bread mingled with the sound of laughter and the warmth of community, the true legacy of their love story would continue to unfold. One day, one challenge, one moment of joy at a time. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Alexander, Olivia, and Sophie joined their guests on the dance floor, their hearts full and their spirits soaring. They had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, more united, and more in love than ever. This was not an ending, but a beautiful new beginning for their family, for Rothschild Global, and for a future bright with possibility. And so, as the music played and loved ones celebrated around them, Alexander and Olivia began the next chapter of their extraordinary journey, not as an arranged match, but as true partners, bound by love, strengthened by adversity, and committed to building a legacy of love, integrity, and purpose.